Uh-oh. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. I think everything should be good. I will try to set everything up on my end.
Are you
Uh,
okay if I'm live right now? Or
Absolutely, no problem at all. This is actually my first time I've ever used a webcam on my stream before with someone else. I've been wanting to try it out, but haven't
Mhm.
done it yet. But yeah, we should be good. You look good on my end, actually.
Okay, cool. You want to do the introduction for your chat and then I'll do it for mine?
Yeah, so guys, this is obviously, I think a lot of you know who Marty is from the Philosophy Chat. Yeah, so we're here to talk about stuff. I don't think we have anything like planned. I think it'll be a pretty laid back discussion, just go with the flow of everything, stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure how many people probably know you, but this is Epoch Philosophy. I basically I was viewing some of my members like about 2 or 3 months ago. So this is the story of how I know about you. About 2 or 3 months ago, I was viewing some of my audience and what type of content that they watch to see like where we have sort of overlapping things. And you were actually one of the highest similarities, I think, in terms of content. So I started watching some of your streams, and then I went on. I
Cool.
think your stream when you were doing the Half-Life 2 thing. So
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I remember I saw you in chat and stuff like that, uh and then I think we talked a little bit on Discord. You said you're a big fan of German idealism, which it's really weird. I'm not very read on German idealism, but I find a lot of the central markings. I'm very well read on stuff like Marxism, but I'm not as well read on stuff like German idealism. Granted, Marxism is often sort of a reply or there's a lot of criticism, yet they utilize the form of German idealism sometimes, not in content, but in form through dialectics and stuff with Hegel. But yeah, I don't know. I really like German idealism. I think the more I learn about it, the more I actually find it a little bit more relevant than even some pure materialism.
yeah. So you kind of wanted to start out with German idealism, and because I before I wanted to go into German idealism, I just wanted to know a little bit about your interests and what you do, uh, what types of metaphysical systems that you kind of have delved into, what type of epistemology you would subscribe to. Unless you don't have a full-fledged system, which is fine as well, and we can kind of. I just wanted to know, sort of air out the room and know where you stand on a lot of things. I'm sympathetic to just about every single type of idea except like relativism or super forms of epistemic error theory or something really
Sure.
dumb like that.
Yeah, so it might make a little bit more sense. I kind of like consider myself sort of like a I'm a very elastic thinker when it comes to philosophy, and that's primarily to do with the fact that I'm actually relatively new to like actual theory and philosophy. So I come from an actual like political science and history background. That's my two majors. I'm about to graduate actually, and the reason I got into theory and philosophy is actually in my mind a lot of the failings of political science. It's an incredibly dogmatic field and overly structured and ideological, and I started learning about critical theory with like the Frankfurt School, and then even later, sort of what some people would call postmodern theory and philosophy. Although I don't know if I'm quite there with that because I don't I think that's way too broad. But like people like Baudrillard and stuff like that. But yeah, so I got into that, and I'm still definitely going through the process of hitting all the philosophers and just sort of really I'm interested in a lot of political questions, but I think philosophy and theory in many ways does a way better job at addressing that than my initial field of like political science.
Hold on, I'm actually having some problems. Oh shoot, failed to connect. That's no good.
Uh-oh. Is it on your end on like Twitch?
Okay, there it goes. Yeah, sorry guys. They just missed the last 5 minutes of our conversation there.
Uh-oh.
Gonna have to do. Yeah, so just real quick, I am talking to Epoch Philosophy right now. It's just for some reason the stream, due to me being in Dallas, guys, I have some weather problems right now. There's been a lot of snow out there. Um, like almost below zero temperatures, and it's caused some sort of disturbances in our internet and our power. If it does go off by any chance in the future, it's going to go. It's because of that. So far, I haven't had any electricity problems, but yeah, right now we're just talking about our interests and what we believe in, and sort of all that sort of crazy philosophical nonsense. Sorry about that. And just for your audience as well, I am on YouTube, the Philosophy Chat, or Marty with Destiny, and I also have my Discord channel, which is just Discord/philosophy. Anyway, sorry about that. Yeah, um, so you said you kind of don't have a built-in metaphysics or an epistemology. You kind of yeah, most of your time is sort of dealt with theory. I mean, what types of
Yeah.
theoretical well, I guess theorists do you sort of subscribe to, or I guess read?
So, okay, so I definitely, again, a lot of how I approach this is through a political lens, right? So, metaphysics would certainly be something more encompassing. Although, I think as far as metaphysics goes, I definitely subscribe to the later sort of processual metaphysics of maybe someone like Hegel or Heidegger. I know that's kind of different from like English philosophy. Again, I'm a political guy, so I know quite a bit about John Locke, and John Locke obviously went into a lot more than just politics, and I think he had sort of a singular view of metaphysics where things are things, they're separate entities, and I think I guess I subscribe to the viewpoint that there are larger processes at large, but that may not necessarily answer your question, but that's at least the scope of my knowledge as far as metaphysics goes. But yeah, usually I take a pretty political lens to a lot of this.
Okay, I see. So I'm guessing by separation you mean sort of Lockean substances
Yeah,
and just everything sort of being viewed monadically instead of dynamically.
correct. Yep,
Okay, yeah.
way better way to put it.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I could talk about some of that if you want, in terms of metaphysics. I'm not really like too studied on someone like Locke, but I do know that America, or just basically like the entire Anglosphere, is sort of riddled with kind of Lockean political ideology,
Oh yeah.
and probably riddled, since you've read Heidegger, with sort of object-oriented ontology, of where everything sort of becomes bare materialistic, sort of scientific paradigm of everything, right? So we're dealing with sort of objects. Everything is a sort of natural process. You know, to use Heideggerian kind of terminology, everything becomes a sort of present at hand object over here, and very entrenched within sort of technology as well. I don't know if you've read. You said you read, I think, Eros and Civilization. I'm not sure
Hmm.
if you read One Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse,
Yeah, I have
but that's
not.
also
Yeah.
okay. Well, that's also a really great work, of where he has this sort of synthesis of Marx and of Heidegger put together, and
Right.
sort of begins tackling issues of technology.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, no. Herbert Marcuse, I really like Marcuse. Matter of fact, there's a little bit of like online controversy with what's his name, Matt. Oddly enough, I'm just happy that this is even being talked about. Typically with the political sphere, no one gives a fuck about critical theory. But I think Matt Taibbi from Rolling Stones was talking about how much he hates. Like, I don't know if you saw that Marcuse. But anyways, I'm not exactly sure what his problems are, but I really like Marcuse in a lot of ways. You know, I think again, I have came from a lot of the typical Marxist sphere of philosophy. But unlike a lot of Marxists, where I think a lot of Marxists are incredibly dogmatic, that I think later critical theory does a lot for the trajectory, the movement of Marxism. A lot of people, I think, with Marxism don't think dialectically whatsoever. I think in many ways, Marxism, at least how it exists, is sort of, especially with like Leninism, Marxism, Leninism, which there are plenty of good things, in my opinion, about Marxism, Leninism, but a lot of they stay in that space. And I think people like Marcuse bringing in some like psychoanalytic viewpoints. You know, you read Eros and Civilization, so understanding Freud from a sociological lens is actually quite useful. I really, really enjoy that. I think as many tools as we can get to viewing things, the better in some ways, right? We can understand the world around us. We can understand sociology better, stuff like that. So I take a pretty pluralistic lens, and I think Marcuse in critical theory kind of helps.
Right, right. It's been a while since I've read sorry, not One Dimensional Man, but Eros and
Mhm.
Civilization. Can you remind me some of the kind of themes from that book,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you
Sure. I know One Dimensional Man's is like most popular one, but I actually have not read that. I've read little sections of it, but I haven't read the book in its entirety. So what? So Eros and Civilization really he wants to. It's a little bit of a reply to the Neo-Freudians, where I think Marcuse sees psychoanalysis as something that's really beneficial, not necessarily in the pure individual psychological sense, although that's perfectly fine. I think he takes that psychoanalysis through time with neo-Freudians got way too singular and individualistic. And he thinks that psychoanalysis through the lens of sociology is much more useful. And I think through a Hegelian lens and even in some ways like a when you look at the political economy, even through like a Marxist lens in some ways. And, that's sort of like there's like two halves. That's like the first half. And then the second half is actually his prescriptive lens. So the problem sometimes with critical theory is that you get to a point where it's like there is no like idea of how to fix shit. Well, Marcuse actually kind of goes into detail about how to maybe fix shit. I think he's got some really good ideas, although I think they might be a little bit short-sighted or maybe too idealistic, maybe. But I like it nonetheless. He takes the approach that all right. He thinks that something like art is something as we can liberate the world through art, quote unquote. Some people misunderstand what he means by that, but what he really means in a lot of ways is that when we look at like a painting, we don't think about its initial use case. We don't think about art. It's like, oh, how is this gonna like immediately when you're struck with the beauty of art, it's just art. It's just there, right? We don't think about its use case, how much money it's gonna make you. Obviously, that'll happen with art, but in that state of like awe or beauty, he thinks that there's like a sacredness of humanity where if we can bring that libidinal feeling into like interactions with humans and how we address socio like economic situations, he thinks that that is a potential avenue to like emancipatory politics, and I like that. I just don't know how well other people will catch on to that.
so in what sense is it going to be emancipatory? Are you saying that the aesthetic domain is going to be used as like a form of expressionalism to like show people, what's going on within the world or something like that?
So kind of I take it more as like how we approach treating human beings, I think, is what Marcuse says. So like art is something where you appreciate its beauty for art, and it's like there's nothing really much more to that in some ways. When a lot of people are struck by art, the aesthetic domain, I think he actually explicitly says that. He says that art as like aesthetic as liberation, where there's this separate domain where we look at like just the
Mhm.
raw beauty. And I think he says that if we get rid of the overly commodified world, we can get rid of the hyper commodification, the fetish of commodification. We can maybe start looking at human beings, and we can start looking at how we structure the our governments, the world, our systems around this sort of aesthetic, sort of maybe just quote unquote. I mean, the best way to describe it is just kind of like maybe love in a corny kind of way, but just like love for people as in the sense that you have like a little bit of a I don't know, when you look at a painting it feels like, oh holy shit, like wow, this is beautiful, or wow, this is cool, and it's not tethered to what it immediately to use, right? Like it's not like, oh, I'm gonna take this painting and fucking yeah, you just look at it and appreciate it for what
Okay.
it is.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm starting to yeah, okay. So the Marcusean themes are starting to kind of flow back. It,
Yeah,
it takes
yeah,
a little bit. It's been about 3 years since I've read Marcuse.
sure.
So I think what you're basically saying, but I think there's a little bit more.
Hmm.
There's two themes I think that's going on here. First, I do think that there's some sort of emancipatory, um, or I guess, yeah, some sort of emancipatory theme within art, right? Art can be used as sort of medium of projecting certain types of ideas, and I think we have this in early sort of Hollywood movies where sort of communist, I don't want to say communist propaganda, but sort of communist films were coming in.
Hmm.
And aesthetics is basically a domain of where you can sort of express certain types of ideas, especially if they're radical, and we do have certain types of examples of that. But
Friedrich
secondly, I think
Schiller
what
has
you're trying to
something
say
similar to
is that
say.
aesthetics
Man
offers a
must
sort
go
of
through
form
aesthetization.
of
Art
thinking
gives
that
humanity
deviates
the
from the types
understanding
of
to be courageous
rationale
agents in
that
society.
seems to be sort of predominant within, say, the Anglosphere, or probably anywhere where we have a sort of technological mindset. That is that, when we do art, when we look at beauty, right, we don't have this sort of mindset that we attribute a certain type of value on it and it's used for a certain types of end. Rather, art is done for art's sake, right? We view beauty for beauty's sake instead of as a means to a certain type of end.
You truly put that in way better words than I ever could have. Truly, thank you.
Sure. So within, well, I mean, it's sort of important because within One Dimensional Man, when you do get around to reading it, um, Marcuse harps on two sort of themes within it. One is technological rationality, and the second one is what was it called? It was some form of repression, repressive desublimation.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah, repressive desublimation and technological rationality, and these two kind of fit together. So the first one is basically a type of rationality that I think you wrote this in the 60s or 70s. I can't exactly remember, but a type of rationality that becomes really prominent in a very industrialized technological society. And the sort of things that he was talking about at this point, it's kind of weird, right? Because we didn't even have the internet at this point. We didn't have all the types of gadgets that we do now. So his points were kind of even more sort of the technological innovations that we're talking about were still a little bit more subtle, and now they've become a lot less subtle. So it's anyways, it's a type of rationality that's oriented towards utilitarian thinking and consequentialist types of ends. So every single technology that we can think about, whether it's roads, airplanes, your computer, has a sort of means to an ends relationship, right? It's made
Correct.
for a certain type of utility. Sorry, it's made for a certain type of utility. So roads, right? They're basically used to get to one place to another really fast. They're great ways of getting to work. Airplanes are a great way of getting, to certain types of long distances to different types of states or countries. And so we build technology basically always within this framework to get things efficiently done, always to be able to do things quicker. And we always try to raise the sort of rate of production, even though, 40 hours a week has basically been a sort of constant in terms of work time. So we're very oriented towards, this type of technology, and we sort of operate our lives, well, sort of operationistically, right? Sort of
Hmm.
in terms of this techne, in terms of this rationality. And when our lives become very embodied within technology, one can say that our autonomy is sort of subordinated, right, to the types of technical apparatuses that are around us. Right now, it's a lot more prominent with cell phones and social media and apps. It's kind of ironic because we're doing this,
Hmm.
um, but back then, you still have the examples of the roads and the airplanes. So, what about that is sort of operational? Roads are a great way of getting to a location, but roads are also going to prevent leisurely walks, right? So now we're just going to be in our cars going through traffic, kind of dealing with that for an hour or 2 hours, sort of separated from others while being in road rage. Airplanes, another sort of thing that a lot of people don't subtly think about is that now that we have the ability to be away from people who are thousands of miles away, um, and sort of visit them at any point that we want with an airplane. Now we can live thousands of miles away from our parents and our, and our family. So this sort of kind of divorces the family unit in a way because now we can do that, right? We can live thousands of miles away, whereas in say the feudal age or something like that, our society was a lot more congealed. It was a lot, it was definitely more communitarian, and now we're kind of isolates. We're separated from the rest of the world, and we're separated from our friends and family in a way, in a sort of different type of way. So as much as people sort of think that technology is great and it makes us all be able to communicate in different types of places, it also separates us in a sort of fundamental way. We no longer get to have that sort of embodied experience. So that's technological rationality, right? And if we are embodied in this form of technological rationality, then the aesthetic forms of rationality are a good way of combating that, right?
Yeah, it's I think Marcuse certainly, and a lot of critical theorists in some ways sort of approach it like that. And it's not to say that this is kind of a Heideggerian question, right? With the question concerning technology,
Right,
um, it's
right.
not to say, right, that like technology is bad and it hasn't improved the livelihood of tons of people, but absolutely there's a dialectic to it, right? There's an opposite end where it does separate ourselves from all kinds of things. And yeah, I think that this aesthetic realm, right? It has sort of a non-objectification of just stuff, and you can maybe apply that non-objectification to humanity, right? And how we treat things, the environment around us, everything. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how the dialectic plays out, but I think what you kind of gave me right there in terms of, it has both of its opposites, and
Hmm.
it has the sort of two diametric opposites or the antinomies right there, where it has positive and negative views. There was one other thing that I wanted to say, and then we can, move on to
Sure,
something else.
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
And that was because this is also another sort of important theme in Marcuse, was repressive desublimation. And I haven't read too much Foucault, but I read I think it was on the book on the history of sexuality
Hmm.
and the repressive his sort of argument against Freud, which was the repressive tendency to yeah, society basically gives us these sorts of repressive tendencies to not talk about taboo subjects like sex or our sexuality, and things like that. And obviously, since we have certain types of repressive tendencies, this causes certain types of psychological tendencies which are bad. Um, but Foucault basically says something like, well, um, that's not quite true. There are these repressive tendencies, sure, but look at, homosexuality, look at bisexuality, but mostly homosexuality at that time, which was going through a certain type of period within the psychological era. It used to be a pathology, and now it's slowly becoming, I mean, it kind of already no longer is a pathology, obviously, in the DSM-5 and in the psychology departments. But at that time, when it was taboo, right, people kind of locked in on it, and people even locked in on it more right now. Um, and the sort of discourse exploded, right?
Hmm.
It wasn't repressed. Uh, and so what happens actually in a society such as ours is that, the discourse, if if it is talked about, isn't actually repressed. We don't repress these types of discourses that are taboo. We actually explode them. But Marcuse's point actually is a sort of reply to even both of those, and he basically says, well, no, there's actually a lot of things that are sort of repressed within our day and era. I mean, I think philosophy is a sort of big example that we have on our, on our agenda. Um, I mean, the universities don't really give a shit about humanities, don't really give a shit about philosophy, and most people until just recently didn't give a shit about Marxism. There was a heavy form of repression within the United States, basically,
Definitely.
to combat sort of Marxist any forms of Marxist thinking. And the Reagan administration and Thatcher managed to do this. The neoliberals managed to do this quite actively.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of universities basically ask the same old questions of where has communism worked within the world, yada yada. So we do have a lot of repressive tendencies within within the world that sort of Marcuse talks about. So the interesting thing about those is those will also sort of cause internal problems and internal struggles. Instead of sublimating our energy to something positive, capitalism or all these businesses that sort of prevent these things from happening by making STEM related fields really big, um, are basically going to shut down those types of discourses and promote discourses that are better for the utility and the technology of our present time instead of talking about philosophy and all that kind of nonsense according to them. So
Yeah, and I think even to even to move and like even transition this to something like Marxism. There's a very Marxist argument to be made about this as well, as far as how ideology initially operates, right? So, like, I believe beforehand, Marx and Engels even talk about this, and they reply to this with ideology was something posited from individuality and from an idealism, right? And that was sort of the German idealistic approach, or idealism approach. And Marx and Engels, they were like, okay, look, this is how social systems operate this way, and capitalism essentially allows the new ideological form to become extremely technocratic. I think there's even there's
Yeah,
like a
yeah.
materialist argument to be made about that as well.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, since you read more about Marxism than me, I'm not really sure how the critique is supposed to go against
Yeah.
idealism with respect to what you were just talking about, and also like everything being sort of driven on a certain type of foundation, and that is
Yeah, Marx
material foundations.
Yeah, Marx and Engels, in my mind, are probably a bit too critical of German idealism. It makes sense in the time, I think, to be a little bit critical. It was this sort of, German idealism at the time was, extremely, like, that was the apex of philosophy, and it still kind of is in some ways. I really like German idealism as well. I think German idealism sometimes, as the trajectory of capitalism moves forward, it almost becomes more relevant in some ways. So, um, like, like consciousness affects the material around you. That's kind of like just the abstract approach with idealism, where Marx and Engels says no, like from the material, your environment, your social structures, yourself, like your biology, there posits consciousness. And I think, and a lot of critical theorists, I think, have kind of came to this conclusion as well, is that, like, well, that's kind of a false dichotomy, right? Especially when you go into like Baudrillard, where Baudrillard now sees a world where there's like, look, we're not just buying material commodities for its functionalism, its use case. There's a sign value to that. They're selling a lifestyle. They're selling an idealism with things, and and this even talking about repressive desublimation. There's so many more idealistic tonalities to material around us that I do think there's a big argument, and this gets a lot of shit from a lot of traditional orthodox Marxists, that
Mhm.
through the time of capitalism we see this sort of reversion back to German idealism. People like Mark Fisher, Baudrillard, and a lot of late critical theorists have sort of said this, but I really like that approach.
Mark Fisher, is he the guy that wrote the
Capitalist realism.
yeah, capital, yeah,
Beautiful,
yeah.
absolutely beautiful book, if you ask me. It's one of those rare books where I don't tell people to read shit half the time, because it's just incredibly hard for people to even get the time, or at least kind of understand the language. And I'm super sympathetic to that, but that is one of those rare books. It's 100 pages. It's one of those absolutely must reads, in my opinion.
Oh, by the way, I just now noticed that you subscribed to my channel.
Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
by the way. I
yeah, no
appreciate it.
problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so to speak a little bit about what you just said, yeah, I kind of have an agreement. So it sort of depends. It's really hard to. I don't want to ever say that I know Marx anywhere close to how much I know German idealism, or really at all, because
Sure.
it takes. I have actually right in front of me. If you see the white volumes right there, all 50 sets of the Marx Engels complete
Dude,
set of.
that
Uh,
is fucking insane. That is like that is a
yeah.
lot of material. That's cool.
So yeah, but I didn't do that just to brag, but I
Yeah.
did that just to show the audience. It would take like fucking 20 or 10 years to probably read all that and digest it in any sort of relevant sense, right?
Mhm.
So I don't want to speak prematurely on Marxist ideology, but I did read a little bit about Engels' nature, and a very little bit. So if what you're saying is true, and I think it's kind of in lines with what he's saying, is that mental notions or ideas don't play a sort of causal role um, within our agency, or within what we do. And I think that's sort of kind of wrong. I tend to
Mhm.
think that a lot of French thinkers and a lot of critical theorists have this sort of view of external constraints sort of manipulating us to where we don't have any sort of agency or free will or autonomy or whatever. And I think that's sort of wrong. And I think the idea that if you just remove ideas altogether, right, will sort of commit you to that view. I might be wrong.
Mhm.
But it seems as though if you do have some sort of ideas or some sort of mental notions that steer how we do things, then you have agency. And if you don't have agency, you don't have free will. So the idea there is to basically, in sort of metaphysics, and this is what the German idealists don't specifically use this terminology, but I think it's there, and a lot of good analytic philosophers basically talk about top-down causation. So we tend to, as modernists or contemporaries or whatever you want to call us,
Mhm.
think of things in terms of bottom-up causation, right? We tend to think of outside of anthropology and sociology and businesses. We tend to think that, well, particles basically or quantum fields sort of deterministically are structured. Um, those basically make up the fundamental chemicals of life, our chemistry. Those make up the fundamental biology of our life. And those basically make up our bodies and our minds. So everything can kind of be viewed reductively. We can kind of just probe whatever these bottom or fundamental interactions are doing. Well, they're going to be responsible for all of the top actions, basically, within biology. And so you get that bottom-up approach, right? But there are some really good examples, I think, in biology, but specifically I wanted to go over like minds, since you mentioned minds,
Mhm.
of top-down causation working, right? And that's just basically with intentional actions or beliefs.
Is
So
just to get a little bit of clarity, is this like a are you making sort of like are you approaching this from like a Cartesian like dualism, like mind body separation, or is this like, external internal sort of thing?
um, no, it's not a Cartesian dualism. The Cartesian dualism sort of subscribes you to an ontological difference between the mind and body.
Right.
I don't want to subscribe myself to an ontological difference
Okay.
between the mind and body. I want to subscribe myself to a causal or a power difference.
Oh, okay.
That is to say that the powers basically that are working in the mental realm are going to subordinate certain types of physical things within the lower sort of realm,
Oh, okay.
um, and sort of transform the physical realm to work in a certain type of uniformity that is subsumed by a concept. So let me try to break that down for you. I'll actually be, instead of going into mental notions, I'll do sort of biology, right? Or a very basic example of a chemical bond. I think this ends up being wrong. I had a
Mhm.
few physicists like PM me and tell me I'm wrong about this, but I think it still does the form justice instead of the content justice. So let's just say that I have sodium chloride, right? One's extremely poisonous. The other one is extremely sort of flammable, right? Taken as sort of monadic properties. And we combine them, right? And we get what do we get? We get salt. And through the sort of dynamic relationship, right, it removes the combustive elements and it removes the poisonous elements and instead creates another power, namely salt, that subsumes both of those causal properties into a new causal property that is neither really combustive nor really flammable, right? You would assume that if these are added together, you'd have a really combustible and really flammable object, but instead you just get salt. Um, so what happens is that you have a form of top-down causation. The dynamic relationships build on something that is greater than the parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And the same thing I think goes with biology once it starts getting into things like homeostasis and metabolism, is that it subsumes those parts, the various organs, the blood, and then you get into functions, right? I mean, the heart does things for certain types of ends. You get telos. Well, eventually, right, if you have all the right types of parts arranged, you get consciousness in some sort of way. This isn't something like above and over the body, at least in terms of it being a new ontological substance. That I don't think that makes any sense.
Mhm.
But we do obviously get new fundamental properties or powers or functions, basically, that you haven't seen before. And so I think that that's what the mind is. Eventually through enough time, um, reality itself creates processes that are self-determining. Um, and that's namely, our agency. It is self-determining in the sense that the effects that we do are produced by causes that we create. So, we are the cause of our own effects
Well,
in a way.
yeah. I actually kind of see that from a little bit from what you just said, sort of from like a materialist lens, right? Where you're talking about the actual formation of materials, their physics or chemistry, whatever. I'm not a scientist, but and then from
Yeah,
there,
neither am I.
it posits sort of a consciousness or something like that. Although, is that sort of the approach that you're taking, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced. So, I mean, I believe in Aristotelian potency,
Hmm.
we don't have to get into that right now.
Sure.
But yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, yeah, I mean that's in some ways, I mean, especially Engels, I think Engels is a lot better explaining Marxism in some ways than even Marx was. He does it in a pretty clear way a lot of the times, especially with like the books Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. He talks a lot about dialectical materialism and that sort of way, right? I think they're trying really hard to kill Hegel, and I think he's like, look, consciousness is formed kind of in a similar way. He used similar examples about cells being multiplying or dying at the same time, and then from that process, that physical process, material process, posits consciousness and humanity and stuff like that. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I know the quote because I recently saw one of your videos. I think it was on the Ingalls book, and then I started reading it.
Mhm.
I got pretty lost in that book because I think it just who was it? Owens and someone else that he mentions. It's a
Yeah.
certain type of historical period that I just had no idea like what it was referring to.
Sure.
So
There's I
uh,
think, was it Saint Max or no, it was some of the early French communists, I think after the French Revolution. I think there were some political thinkers that noticed after the French Revolution, it was almost a new because the French Revolution wanted to save France sort of from the dictatorship, the aristocracy, right? And then I think what they noticed is through the revolution, we saw a new sort of aristocracy. That was sort of the idea of Saint. I can't remember his name, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. There's some weird thinkers, just like Robert Owen as well, who kind of practiced socialism in the United States and a little in Indiana, a little town, and the results were really good until it capitulated to capitalism. And yeah,
oh shit.
yeah.
Do you know what caused it to move, or
Yeah,
just
I don't actually know. It's actually very interesting. So Robert Owen, I think that's who I'm thinking about it, right? He was a Welsh textile owner, and he was a devout. Like I think he really liked the idea of socialism or the future towards communism, and he decided to take a couple people, move to Indiana, create essentially what a commune, and for the first time, actually, education was really good. People only worked. It's actually hilarious. It shows how and it shows that just the difference in work place stuff. So Engels is like saying, he's like, instead of working 16 hours or instead of working like 16 hours a day like you see in industrial capitalism, well, they only work 10 hours in Indiana. I just thought that was kind of funny because 10 hours a day that's a long fucking work day. But it essentially showed that like in a communal system and what Robert Owen kind of had set up in Indiana. I can't remember what the town's New Haven, I think is what it was called. Yeah,
oh yeah, but
I think
yeah,
yeah, like work days were a bit shorter. Safe, the work, like the conditions were better. Everyone in that little commune had access to education for free. I think no one went without. I don't exactly know. Yeah, and then someone in my chat said they also had a higher productive output. Yeah, that's another thing too. Actual productivity, which there is a very Marxist. It's funny. A lot of people think Marxism is like anti-work or whatever. No, there's actually, in some ways, I think this is kind of a flaw in Marxism, but there's a very like sort of, in some ways, I would say a fetish of productivity, even in Marxism. But that's right. The productivity in New Haven was quite high. And so he essentially used that town as sort of an argument for like, look, like socialism has worked before. There's been some problems. It went away. He didn't really go into detail, I don't think, from the book about why New Haven failed. It probably would have been a good idea to do that. I'm not exactly sure, though, what happened with New Haven, but I know it did. It did fall apart in a couple of years.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of the most interesting part of your video is when you get these sort of practical examples of where socialism sort of works,
Mm-hmm.
because it's obviously one of the number one questions that you sort of get asked
100%.
probably. Yeah, it's so it gets really annoying. I mean, the work hours thing is also sort of interesting to me. Um, I remember having a conversation with one of my neoliberal classic friends. He basically was trying to make fun of the guy who makes existential comics,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
the guy from existential comics was basically saying like, look, I mean, we have a lot of new technology, right?
Hmm.
We have a lot of new automation. I mean, we've made progress in terms of the STEMs, and we've made in terms of STEM related fields, in terms of medicine and engineering and all that. Why are we still working 40 hours a week? Why hasn't that like decreased at all? And then one of my friends, did a sort of history of the hours that we've worked in, I think within the United States, and then he sort of compared it to the 1920s and
Right.
1910s and the early 1800s, in the beginning of the sort of industrial revolution in the 1800s. And, he concluded that, people worked like 60 or 70 hours back then. But I'm starting to think to myself, well, that's true. But that's not a good
Yeah.
comparison, like in terms of historical hours that we worked. I mean, you go back before the Industrial Revolution, you go back to the feudal ages, you go back to, I don't know, like any like the Greek era or whatever, and then you find like a decrease in dramatic amounts of time, especially if you're like a farmer or whatever, right?
Hmm.
Because you're not going to be working during the winter most of the time,
Right.
and even if you are working during the days, it really depends on where you are geographically. It's not always the same, but a lot of them worked less than 30 hours a week,
Hmm.
and if not 30, if 40 hours a week, then you could still average out the total time that they work per year, and it'd still be a lot less than the amount of toil that, like certain Americans work right now, which I think is about averaged at 38 hours a week or something like that.
Right. And I think there's I think, this is important with, again, Marxism, especially in the online sphere, is so incredibly non-nuanced and history and whatever. But I think it's like it's hard to underscore the sheer kind of horrid working relations that were present in Marx and Engels' day. Like people were working like 100-hour weeks or some shit, and it was like, I mean, even feudalism in many ways, like you just said, like it wasn't actually nearly as I don't. I think I would like to say that the sort of working conditions and the form of how they worked was actually better than in like the height of industrial capitalism, where people were just, oh my god, they made no money, they worked in factories like 100 hours a week, and in that way it's hard to make predictions. A lot of people they'll use it as sort of a bible. They're like, oh well, Marx and Engels said this about this, they would think X policy is good today or X policy is bad today or that's lib shit. Well, it's hard to kind of say what they would think because it is radically different, right? So, like in today's world, like 8-hour workdays is quite short compared to what industrial capitalism has. But at the same time, like you were saying, like that's like we should still be striving to try to minimize the needed work output of workers, and there's probably some material argument to, well, not some, there is a material argument to be made that, yeah, people work way more than they should. It's, obviously, they're, people at the top, the quote unquote bourgeoisie or, CEOs or whatever who owns quote unquote the means of production. I'm using abstract terminology here. There's a reason why people work at what they work. They want to take and siphon as much profit as possible. Again, there's some nuance to that, and but yeah, no, I think there absolutely is an argument. We should be whether something will work in its totality. I don't think necessarily is the point for future politics. The point is that look, we have these problems here. There's still problems, even though they're better. And we should try fundamentally to move forward, but that's absolutely not how the political process works whatsoever. It's if anything, I think the political process itself is pure, and I mean pure. I don't say this very often, but it pretty much is. There's an opposite to a lot of things, but I don't see an opposite here very often. There is like a pure form of political maintenance. That's sort of like the main goal. It's a maintenance like thing where we'll make some changes here and there in order to maintain things, though. And I think, holy fuck, that approach has a lot of people suffer because of that. We don't fundamentally try to fix problems. We try to maintain the system at large.
So you're kind of criticizing gradualism, basically the idea that we should only
Well,
sort of incrementally make changes here and there, raise the minimum wage.
actually, not necessarily. I actually argue that even gradualism isn't necessarily like. I mean, of course it is, but it's sort of like a gradualism from like like a reaction to like it's a reaction to a problem within the system, and that maybe that gradualism is to keep the system sort of going, right. There isn't the idea to fundamentally change it, right. It's to make sure that we can try to keep this system as stagnant as humanly possible. I still kind of that's a point that Marx and Engels really kind of showed with the political economy, and that's something I still I think they got right.
Mm. So I mean, like, what types of perspectives do you hold that you think that could kind of begin to radically change these, or are you sort of also in the same boat that I am in terms of a little bit of feudalism or futility in trying to change these systems at this era?
So I apologize. I was what was that question again?
Yeah, I mean, like, I was wondering if you had any sort of like, what would be some of your perspectives that would help sort of change this from a type of gradualism to a radical transformation to how our system is run, or
That
do you not?
is, yeah. That's sort of the $1 million question, right? I
Right.
don't. I have some like larger ideas. First, I think like the mode of I think one thing, education is certainly a big thing. Like we still have a literacy problem. Not only do we have a literacy problem, we have like a critical thinking problem too. And this, I mean, is infested even with people who like people. I think you would agree with this too. I think one of the most radically important things we could do is teach like just sort of almost like intro level analytical philosophy in the public system, public education system. Restructure how we approach education from the bottom up. Um, it's hard. I don't exactly know, right? And then you have the other thing is a lot of people say revolution will solve this, and we need to just completely topple the bourgeoisie institutions. And then from there, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then have a top-down planned economy. Blah blah blah. That's essentially. I don't know if that's even. There's a lot of questions. I'm not exactly sure, but I think smaller things like looking at it a little bit deeper. Look at education, how people think. Um, a maybe I want to say like creating an environment where we talk about these things in a uh intellectual perspective, because it's typically like, you spent time on Destiny stream and stuff like that. A lot of this shit is just hyper very ideological blood sport, or it's like politics is entertainment. Truly, there's no real mainstream intellectual approach to politics online, or even in many ways in person, right? People who are even involved in politics, they only talk about like online politics. They don't really talk about theory. They don't talk about philosophy. So I actually think that the issue is much deeper than just pure systemic things, and revolution will solve this. It's a very Marxist Leninist tonality. I think it's kind of deeper. I think there's a lot of individual baggage we have to get rid of, namely the individual baggage from just ideology and politics as entertainment and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. Quick question
Mhm.
before I kind of reply to some of that. I mean, how do you feel about Marxist market socialism?
So it depends on what you mean by market socialism. I think a lot of people, right? So people talk about social democracy and democratic socialism. I kind of consider market socialism sort of like, is that democratic socialism? It's like you have a robust public sector, and then the private sector is pretty much just co-ops. Is that
Yeah.
market? Yeah,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
yeah. No, I in many ways I think that's when we ask the question like what, all right, what's the system past capitalism, in the 20th century it was like a Marxist Leninist system, right? We saw that in Russia and China. I don't, and those failed. I know you get really big shit for saying that, but they did fail. And I think something like market socialism or democratic socialism with the rise of automation is probably the most realistic system past capitalism. That'll probably happen. Probably.
Okay. I have one of my friends, basically. I don't know if you've ever seen his stream, Perspective
William
Philosophy, who
Manning was
recently
a
talked
radical
to
Democrat in
Destiny, and
colonial
I
America.
do some
He
streams with
wanted to
him
build a
occasionally.
national
He claims
association of
himself a sort of
laborers across
Marxist
the 13
socialist.
states.
Sorry, market socialist. I keep
Hmm.
sorry, Freudian slip. Um, yeah, I just the little literature that I have read within Marxism, because there's just a lot. Um, I don't understand how people reconcile the two, especially because from what I'm seeing from certain people like Andrew Kilman and this one blogger who I can't remember the name off the top of my head, who kind of study the labor theory of value, see a general correlation between price prices, um, price
Mm-hmm.
value or exchange value,
Mm-hmm.
and labor value. And they generally see with the increase of automation, there's a sort of natural tendency of the rate of profit to sort of fall
Mm-hmm.
and the prices to sort of fall in tandem with that. And so what it eventually goes down is if you look at the graphs, and they kind of have the empirical evidence to sort of back this up,
Mm-hmm.
presumably, is that eventually the rate of profit's going to decline so far that, you just can't make money off of the type of market system that we have. And that will inevitably lead to the collapse of capitalism. So if those predictions are right, if those predictions are in any sort of sense right, I think that kind of disbands a lot of these debates altogether, and also sort of disbands this idea of market socialism, because I still think that there's going to be some sort of capital involved within that type of system.
Right. I'm actually not too educated on the core economics. I mean, a lot of people, I'm talking from the perspective of like a lot of people who just navigate politics online. People don't even realize Marxism is like a very economic field. It's not just like, it's totally like Marxism is a very deep field, and it's very, the side of economics with Marxism, I don't know too much about. I've talked to some people about it. So I actually have a book that I bought. I've been meaning to read it. It's called Socialism or Extinction. I think he makes the guy Ted Reese, who essentially wrote this book. I think he makes a similar economic argument. I assume he's very well versed in Marxist economics. I'm personally not, so I can't quite say. I still need to read it.
Hmm.
But that is sort of the argument, right? We have debates around like, all right, look, the American left, right, is pretty much just social democrats, people like AOC, Bernie Sanders, and then even people like Ted Reese, who study economics from a Marxist perspective. They say that like, look, like we can't even have social democracy. The rate of profit is going to fall so immensely. We're not going to be able to keep these systems.
Right.
And
Right.
and I had a talk with a guy named Prillicult. He makes YouTube videos. I think I would like to say he's probably comes from the Marxist Leninist perspective, but anyways, he was like, we're already seeing signs of this in the UK. He's British. And he said they're already starting to ration at like a record rate, like healthcare. Like immigrants will have to pay for their healthcare. Like we're already seeing the massive decline. And so even the discussion of social democracy, or maybe something like market socialism, might be like it might be bad. So I think the approach to that is like complete decommodification. And if that is complete decommodification, sorry, I don't know. I don't know how to even rationalize that. I'm not economically
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, this is basically a few Marxist economics
Yeah.
economists basically talking about. But it is interesting, and Andrew Kilman actually does a pretty good book on the labor theory of value and the sort of follies of capitalism, and it's called The Tendential Fall of the Rate of Profit, basically. And there's all sorts of good, I think, work done, and that I need to read a little bit more about. But that's like, I think, I mean, I know obviously it's not about winning certain types of arguments sometimes in philosophy, but God damn it, if you're talking with people who really piss you off and you want to knock down argument, that's kind of where I've been wanting to lead myself towards, is the labor theory of value and its general correlation with exchange prices, or just price in general. And because that will eventually show that capitalism is inevitably going to fall.
Yeah.
If it is inevitably going to fall, it doesn't matter where it hasn't worked before. Sorry, where socialism hasn't worked before. It doesn't matter where, like pointing to certain types of examples of like capitalism succeeding. It's just going to fail, and you're going to have to find certain types of replacements there, and you're going to have to start sooner than later, or else things are going to go wrong. So that's kind of why I'm also a little bit suspicious of forms of gradualism. But I wouldn't what's the word? I wouldn't like stake my life on any of these claims, of course. But I am a little bit suspicious of gradualism. Um, what you said earlier about education, for example, I don't know if because of the sort of invested interests that people have in academia. I mean,
Hmm.
you could especially see this if you're in the university and you're doing your PhD degree, or sorry, or your master's degree. I haven't done my PhD. I'm going to be hopefully getting into soon if I can.
Cool. Yeah.
Um, it's like they're really underfunded. Like some of the certain
Yeah.
types of programs that we're interested in are really fucking underfunded. The things that are taught in grade school are just like fucking bad, right? There's a book. I brought this up in my channel by have you ever heard of the gentleman Ivan Ilyich,
Um, I
the
d-
theorist?
I've heard the name, but I don't know much. Yeah.
Yeah, so he wrote a pretty good book. It's called Deschooling Society. And then basically just the sort of follies and all sorts of shit that's wrong with the modern day education system, and how it's sort of built. You know, this is kind of a cliche now because of Foucault. How it's sort of built like a prison system, um, but also just that it fails to do everything that it attempts to do. First of all, it really doesn't try to educate us in a lot of ways
Hmm.
about a lot of sort of things. When it does, it has a lot of propaganda. We can kind of see this in historical studies in our history
Right. This
classes,
is
right?
a lot of like Althusser as well. A ton of even Foucault and Deleuze. Yeah.
Yeah, so it sort of fails us in the historical ends. It doesn't really let us find the certain types of topics that we want to explore and become really good at them. It has a sort of curriculum-based agenda to it that you have to follow. You have to go from class to class. Those are generally 50 minutes to an hour and 30 minutes long. There's a bell schedule, there's a lunch schedule. You're cocooned in a sort of institution, and you're told how to think. And the educators have a sort of triple crown. They're your psychologists, they're your parents, and then they're your educators as well. And they tell you how to think and what to think and how moral. I mean, like what your type of morality is. And you don't get to explore any sort of ideas that you
Right.
sort of want to, right? And when you get into a certain type of specialization, a lot of those types of fields become irrelevant.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that we shouldn't study math, that we shouldn't study history, but Ivan Ilyich has a really good, I think, fairly simple solution to a lot of these, and these are what he calls like learning networks. So instead of having and this would obviously work, I think, better in a sort of Marxist socialist world, and maybe in a Marxist society, if you want to call, if such a thing exists, anyways,
Hmm.
a post-capitalistic society, I should say, of where we have learning networks that are sort of designed to sort of specialize in topics or go off in certain types of topics that people can opt in and then talk with all the best professionals, basically, or talk with all the sort of leading experts or the people who want to get educated into these systems. Instead of having a sort of centralized form of education of where you have to opt in at a certain early age and then become a sort of prisoner to it, and then show up and then go through all that hassle. The way that our education system, I think, is currently structured also um, treats young people as, I mean, as kids.
Right.
Um, you go into a different society, and Ivan Ilyich mentions this. I can't remember the country that he mentions it, but like basically kids working in certain types of fields to help their parents or with farms, have jobs. Um, and the idea of even talking about 14 or 13-year-olds in certain places and call them kids is sort of odd to these parents, right? They don't have that same type of relationships that we do with our kids. In that we tend to treat them as like as inferior, as not being able to think, and we kind of gradually give them sort of curriculums on how to think, instead of like letting them discover, be more divergent thinkers, have more autonomy, get to pick their own sort of path. If they want to do philosophy, why don't you let them research philosophy? If they want to do computer science, why don't you let them do it in a certain very early age?
Right.
And invest networks into these sorts of things that are sort of publicly owned, right? Um, I mean, that would solve, I think, a lot of the types of issues, but maybe you would get onto a lot more issues, also sort of subtracting it from the government. But
Yeah, I think right. So that's why I kind of point to, I think there is a common conclusion to come to when you talk about solving these issues. When you start looking at, okay, how do we solve these issues? You come to the insufficiencies, and holy fuck, is education one of the most insufficient like apparatuses ever. And and it's one of those apparatuses that are you can see that, like, God, a lot of the insufficiencies come from that as well. And so I think that's where like where my focus on how do we fix this shit is something like education. And I think it makes sense that so many people have focused on education as not only the issue but potentially how we fix this. And I think that's right. Where that approach, that network, is sort of like, that's, isn't that like the most intellectual thing that you could do in my mind? Like I think that it at least, like, if you allow people to choose, it at least allows people to take things seriously, right? When you have a centralized authority and how you partition workload, you can't take it seriously because there is no choice, right? There is no there is no impetus to do anything. You just go through the motions because even if you like it or not, you have to, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think that, yeah, I think that's it. I think and then even deeper than that, I find that one of the biggest things that I found was when I first took an intro to philosophy course, which really should have just been called critical theory or critical thinking in college. I realized how hard it was, and how many people failed it, and the reason why it was hard is because we're brought up to think in such illogical ways, and that made me really think. I'm like, holy fuck, are we behind? I actually don't even know how I got it. I mean, it was a wonderful class. I'm a continental philosophy fan, but I really do appreciate analytical philosophy. But it's hard. It's very concrete, specific, and it shows, holy shit, the sheer amount of inadequacies of how we think. That's why like 18, 19-year-olds were failing this class when it was the most basic forms of logic, right?
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, I teach introduction to philosophy basically at a college right now. I think I
Mm-hmm.
told you that. Um, and I don't make my students do too much. I think I
That's
make
good.
them read I make them read a textbook. There are no tests whatsoever. I don't care for tests. Don't think they work in the sort of medium which is philosophy. But they have to. And the school requires me. I think whoever the higher ups in terms of education systems go,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to introduction to philosophy classes, they require me to do an essay, and I'm actually okay with doing an essay. I think essays are basically the best way of testing out the sort of waters of what these sort of students know.
Agreed. Yeah.
Um, so when I teach essays, when I make people do essays, I kind of make them do a proposal and then I make them do an essay. And then, a lot of people coming from high school, especially or early college, think that, they do great in writing. Uh, they think like, well, if science and math are their difficulties, then English was definitely their strong suit. So they should be able to write essays, at least to be able to get an A or a B, quite easily. Um, it's unfortunate though because people who come into an introduction to philosophy class, at least where I am, really struggle. I mean, are really struggle
Yeah.
writing informal arguments. I don't think they've ever been taught how to write informal arguments. They've been taught how to write essays
Yep.
and how to summarize things and how to give sort of a sort of descriptive analysis of what they've read. But I asked them to give an argument, and then I asked them to provide syllogisms, and they're really, really lost.
Yeah.
Uh, to the point of where I'm just like, shit, man. Maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I shouldn't be like teaching from a textbook right now, but I should be teaching them informal argumentation. And so I was thinking about actually recently because I was talking with one of my friends adopting Sextus Empiricus's outlines of perennialism, or sorry, perennialism, perennialism. I can't even pronounce it right now. The ancient Greek sort of skeptic book of where you take two antithetical notions and then you find out, instead of synthesizing them, you find out you can't take either position, so you should remain sort of skeptical about these sort of broad perspectives. The good thing about that book right here is that a lot of the arguments are basically it presents a lot of arguments to where the student can begin thinking who's winning and who's losing in these sorts of arguments. What are these people talking about in terms of metaphysical presuppositions, and which one should take and which one they should take? And some of the arguments are, it's not quite obvious, apparently, who is winning these their argument, right? It's not quite obvious who has the better argument of the two, and it really makes you try to think why this person over that person has a better argument. What are the sort of formal tools, or what are the sort of concepts that they're dealing with that make their argument stronger? Um, so I mean, it's just like, I think one of the types of prerequisites that my college needs to do, although I'm sort of it's now the burden's on me, is to teach formal thinking before philosophy, just, informal logic in general. I don't mean formal logic. I don't think you need to know, propositional logic or anything like that in order to do philosophy.
Right.
Maybe a lot of analytic philosophy you do, but I don't know about, the history of philosophy or Aristotle or Kant or
Right.
anything like
That
that.
that's sort of so I graduated from a community college for my first 2 years, then went on to university. I think that's the approach they took. The intro class was really not even like it wasn't even really like philosophy, really. I mean, it was, but it was primarily just critical thinking, and it was hard. I mean, it was pretty tough given that was my first real introduction to that stuff, but it fascinated the hell out of me. That's kind of the reason why I even do this. But I do a lot of continental philosophy and theory, so it's very different. But that fascinated me. There's almost like a structure, quote unquote, science of thinking that, dude, like coming from high school in the United States, I had no fucking idea that existed. Holy shit. No one does. No one knows that exists whatsoever coming out of high school. It's devastatingly, like, it's depressing.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, I don't mean to dox you. I mean, maybe this isn't a
Yeah.
question
Yeah.
that
No,
you can
no
really answer,
problem.
but how old are you right now, and when did you start kind of doing philosophy?
So I'm 23, and so again, I went to a community college. I live in Kansas City, and I went to a community college in the Kansas City area. At one of the there's like 4 campuses. I'm not going to give the actual campus.
Sure, yeah,
Well,
yeah,
fuck it. I don't care. I just don't want to know where. I don't want people knowing where I live now. But I grew up in Independence, Missouri, and went to a local community college in that
yeah.
area. And yeah, and so I took the intro to philosophy class. I always appreciated philosophy, right? But even in high school, I'd watch videos about like Alan Watts and like Eastern philosophy and stuff like that. Terrence McKenna, right? And sort of the philosophy of psychedelics. But that's very approachable, like sort of like it's a little bit in my mind, now looking back, it's very surface level philosophy in some ways. And partially it's not their fault, right? Psychedelics have been outlawed and they can't go too much in detail because they weren't able to experiment in a scientific context. Anyways, that was my only approach. And then I hit, did that critical thinking class, took a logic class. And then I went on to university. I was political science. I'm a political science and history double major. And I'm pretty much done with my political science degree. And throughout those classes, I really I was also reading and listening to, in podcast form and doing some reading on like continental philosophy and some ideas with critical theory. And I was like, holy fuck. And it just like it answered a lot of the pertinent, immediate political questions. And political science, these classes I was taking, it didn't even touch any of it. Like it was so radically insufficient. And
Yeah.
it felt like astrology more than and like my professor would speak about things in such confidence about a study, and then you look at the study. One, it's structured like shit. It's not. The funny thing is, it's not even actually scientific. And they would speak about things in such confidence. It felt like it was just like unbelievably bad. And so I started, looking at theory at large as to understand the sort of larger backdrop to how we approach politics and stuff like that. And that was sort of my journey. And then from here on, I really liked learning about it, and I decided to make a couple of YouTube videos, and I guess they kind of got fairly popular, and here I am.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting story. It's interesting because I think a lot of people's journeys in sort of philosophy begin this way, of where they are introduced this sort of arcane, esoteric language, and you're
Yep.
like,
Yep.
fuck, like this language exists. You mean I can talk about immaterial things? You mean like that there's like minds that might not be completely material? You mean there's like opposition to the general types of to the types of like political thinking that we have? It's like an entire history about it, right?
Right.
There's an
And
entire history of
I
it.
think you hit the nail on the head. Is you said there's like this people's immediate understanding of philosophy is some like esoteric shit, and that is totally like that is not like
Yeah,
that is not it. But that's what most people think of when they think of like I'll tell people I make videos. Sometimes they ask what I do, and since I'm in college, this is actually my only income right now is YouTube, and they're like, oh, what do you go to college and you do that? I'm like, oh, I make some videos about philosophy and shit. They're like, oh wow, have you heard of like Buddha and shit? I'm like, I mean, yeah, Buddha's great. Like that's learning about the history of religion's wonderful. But that's totally like it's so far removed from what most people.
Sure,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Uh, yeah. I I mean, the funny thing is, I actually got into philosophy because it's kind of a mushy story because I took interest in a person, and they began talking in that sort of language. And then once they began talking in that sort of language, I was just like, well, shit, I mean, I don't know if I quite understand you, but it sounds interesting. And so that made me actually study certain types of historical thinkers that they were talking about. And the first one that I think I tried reading and failed was Schopenhauer and Kant. Um, yeah, I went head deep into transcendental metaphysics, and I was just like so committed to idealism at that point. I was very sure that everything had to be sort of subjective or mind dependent, whatever the fuck that meant.
Hmm.
That we had absolutely no actual access to the world, and therefore truth had to be some sort of illusion. Turns out that that was completely not what they were talking about. Well, I mean, to an extent, obviously, that things are very mind dependent for the transcendental idealists, but nonetheless, it sort of launches you into that program, and then you begin kind of trying to find yourself out of that maze and sort of structure yourself systematically. When people begin that sort of project of epistemology and metaphysics, what generally attracts them are very spicy, are very um, wrong ways of viewing the world, right? Berkeley idealism, skepticism, nihilism, anti-realism, relativism, Cartesianism of the sort of dualistic sort, uh, which it's not completely crazy. I know some people who are still staunch substance dualists. It's weird, or Mysterians. But outside of those people who can really defend it, right? Most of those perspectives were just dead wrong,
Right.
and you needed to like read a lot more, right? Up to the point of where I've read at least 200 books or so in philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. I really don't think I knew shit, and um, I know you said you favor continental philosophy. I don't think there is a divide myself. It's one of
Right.
the it's one of those YouTube videos that I think I'm going to make in the future about how there is no analytic continental divide.
100%. I use that for the sake of language. I'm actually, I completely agree in a lot of ways. I like maybe there is like some divides as like a subset of fields that people want to subscribe to or say or label themselves as. But yeah, when you look at it closely, there is not that much of a divide. And if there is, I try to explain to people too. That even something like continental philosophy is so much more analytical than like fucking secular talk on YouTube or fucking people talking about politics and news, like news commentary, which people think that's like concrete, like analysis of like, the political sphere or whatever, life and culture at large. And it's just totally not. And, I've had some people kind of essentially just shit on me. They're like, oh, you're into too much continental philosophy. I'm like, you understand that like in a lot of ways, like these continental philosophers are very well studied and they subscribe to a lot of analytical bases and they don't, it's
Well,
yeah.
well, but luckily for you, you're getting into the political end of continental philosophy if there
Yeah.
is such a thing. So nobody can shit on that. I mean, all of the good literature in political theory is continental. I mean, nobody takes
Yeah.
analytic Marxism seriously. I mean, I know there's some universities out there, but I know
Right.
Marxism, when it comes to theory related to that, is largely continental and largely dialectical. There are some people that want
Hmm.
to remove the dialectic, especially analytic philosophers, want to remove the dialectic side of Marxism, which is very, very odd, I think.
I do too. I think it's super odd. I think I and
Oh, you do too.
yeah, I do. I think a lot of people, even whether they realize it or not, when they say they're Marxist, they don't understand they actually operate in a Marxist terrain that's very undialectical. So, but they don't even, because I don't think a lot of Marxists even again, my problem with and again, I say this as someone who's pretty Marxist in my immediate politics and in philosophy in some ways, but most Marxists that I've come across don't actually fucking understand anything about Marx. And I know a lot of other people who are Marxists will say that. But I think a lot of people get their immediate politics and everything from an online like sort of very unintellectual sphere of stuff. And that I say that and I try to avoid sounding elitist, but and I've had to grapple with it. Intellectualism and elitism are totally separate things. It's just they're conflated all the time. And
Sure.
um I think I just think that as far there is such a lack of understanding and insufficiency in how we address any like political theory, like most normal. Nonetheless, people have no fucking. There's just essentially a rabbit hole of lack of understanding everywhere, and that doesn't exclude myself in some ways. And yeah, man, I mean, I think when you say that taking out the dialectics of Marxism, that's very like anti-Marxist in a lot of ways, but nonetheless, if you want to take a non-dialectical approach to Marxism, that's fine. It's just that's kind of a rupture and change from Marxism, if you ask me.
No, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, right.
Okay, okay, yeah. So because analytic Marxism is where it deviates
Right.
from that. I think I actually have 3 books on specifically this idea that because this was a debate apparently in I think the 1960s and 70s as well, if we can remove it or not. And there was there's somewhat of a shift occurring. It's more so now, but there was a shift occurring at that point, and at least at that time, they thought the idea was crazy, and now it's like become a little bit more acceptable.
What's that?
Uh,
What's that idea?
oh, that we can remove the dialectic
Oh,
from Marx. Yeah.
yeah, I've heard there's a person who actually has an entire like I think a 10-year project or like plus like 15-year project online in one blog setting, and they have like hundreds of HTML pages of them explaining why we got to do away with dialectics from Marx. I haven't delved into it, but I've had people link this to me like, what do you think about this? I'm like, well, first off, this is like 10,000 pages worth of shit. But someone, dude, I don't know who it is, but holy fuck, they went through like a rabbit hole of removing dialectics from Marx, and every single book in the canon of Marxism was addressed in that tonality. But yeah, some people definitely
That's
think
crazy.
that. Yeah, I know. I couldn't even dive into that deeply. But yeah, some people definitely think that I find a ton of value in dialectics, at least in a very abstract sense.
Yeah, I mean, most of the dialectics that I am sort of familiar with are Hegelian dialectics,
Right.
particularly within the science of logic. And holy shit, I mean, it's just like
It's
I don't know how it is
uncomfortable.
in the I don't know how it is in the Marxist tradition, but like the dialectics in the science of logic, just like are they just do not give themselves to like public exchange. It's just
Mhm.
like so when the nothing vanishes into the or is the immediate same thing as being, and being is the same thing as nothing, and then they somehow manage to construct becoming. I mean, like what exactly is going on there? It's obviously not the same thing as an thesis and antithesis.
Right.
I know this is it's kind of even cliche to talk about that, but it's also become a cliche to even talk about it being cliche now.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Uh, but it's true, I think, to a certain extent that that's just not how it exactly went in Marx. If you sorry in Hegel, if you open up the science of logic, he uses the word sublimation or to sublimate or to basically
Offbong.
to yeah
Yeah.
offibong, yeah, it's
Offibong.
to
Is that
take
right? Yeah.
yeah to take two sort of concepts and then bring them together and make them rise from sort of a ladder process,
Mhm.
rise from the prior two concepts that were seemingly antithetical, or like in sort of Kantian antinomies. Um, so it's very hard. I have rarely been able to convince people of the science of logic and why that would be a sort of presuppositionalist philosophy. Um, Most people don't know what the fuck that means to start
Right.
presuppositionlessly. Most people don't care to. Most people are that I've talked to, especially a lot of people I debate on philosophy, happen to be analytic philosophers. That's just where a lot of debates come from.
Right.
Don't even believe due to, and I sympathize with them due to people like Wilford Sellers and McDowell. They don't believe in foundationalism of any sort. And I agree that Hegel is not a foundationalist in the dogmatic sense, but there's kind of a mystical foundation in the science of logic. I won't explicate too much because this can get complicated.
Sure.
Um, there's a sort of mystical foundation within the science of logic that I think is sort of undogmatic,
Mhm.
and analytic philosophers need to somehow find how to make sense of that given the sort of anti-foundationalist trajectories within their contemporary literature. So now a lot of them have sort of jumped gear to coherentism. They have jumped gear into basically getting rid of what's called the myth of the given, that is some sort of non-inferential, sometimes non-conceptual starting point. So for example, certain types of basic beliefs like Descartes' cogito, or whatever other types of foundational beliefs, say within cosmological arguments, that God gave rise to all these sorts of objects and other contingencies. All these contingencies have to derive from some sort of necessity. That's a type of foundationalism that I'm kind of talking about. And there's been a large attack on that type of foundationalism, well, not just by the German idealists, especially Kant, but within analytic contemporary literature.
So what would you define, I know some people have a little bit different ideas about foundationalism. What would you define as like true like foundationalism, like in the context you're using it?
So there's all sorts of things. Like I basically said, I mean, certain types of people think that the cogito is a sort of foundational principle because you can't doubt that you're doubting.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
so if we were to start anywhere, we would begin with the cogito, right? That's the sort of most famous one, the ergo cogito sum. Other types of foundationalism, foundationalist projects are, again, the cosmological arguments. But I don't know, it could be other types of basic beliefs. You could have a lot of starting points, actually. They're called basic beliefs because we don't need inferences in order to make these beliefs. We just sort of know them. So examples are, how do we know that we weren't constructed 5 seconds ago with all of our memories basically intact, such that they would be exactly consistent with the hypothesis that we had actually millions of years before us, right? Well, according to these people that believe in basic beliefs, you can't. So there's nothing to make that inference, but yet we believe it. So it's basic, and we have to believe it. It's just a basic belief. Another type of basic belief might be the unity of the subject. So, for example, a Humean skeptic saying, like, well, how do we know that there is an I that attaches itself to every single thing that we do or every single belief that we have? How do we know that the belief that we have right now is, the same, partakes in the same indexed system that is referring to the me, Marty, that takes place 5 seconds from now or 10 seconds from now? Well, there's no way to prove it, so we have to have a basic belief that the unity of subject is something out there. But it might be another type of foundationalism, which, as it stands, is like, take all the bodies of beliefs, the conjunction of all our beliefs, and basically, where does this belief come from? Well, it has to come from, I don't know, some sort of event, some sort of natural thing, some sort of prior belief that was justified. Where does that one come from? Well, it has to come from another one. Well, this just can't keep going infinitely. So it has to be some sort of foundation at the sort of the end of the sort of yellow brick road, right? Maybe that's not a good metaphor because that toggles an end instead of a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, there has to be, according to them, a sort of belief. And this
Like
led a lot of
like a
yeah.
just like an a priori belief, just like an inherency to something.
So that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, there's disputes whether or not these are a priori beliefs. The general claim with people who make a basic beliefs are not saying they're a priori. They're they're generally a posteriori claims that just
Okay.
can't be related to other a posteriori claims. So, like, for example, how would you a priori prove that the hypothesis of 5-secondism is true or false?
Right.
You couldn't. It's not an a priori claim, according to some people. It's just something that we've kind of gathered from empirical events, and then we've synthesized it together, but we have no idea how we did that. So
So
we don't know how we did that. So it must be basic.
so yeah, so I find that like so this sort of maybe this might help. I know this is probably like I don't want to insult the intelligence of my viewer base. My viewer base are very smart. A lot of them are smarter than me. But like maybe to concretely like oppose this, I think that like where continental philosophy, like maybe just to make sense of this for people, So that's a very analytical point, right? It's a very concretely like we have to get down to the nitty gritty in some ways, and I think like a lot of continental philosophers, what they'll do with that, like especially people like Zizek, explicitly is like it doesn't really, like we're explaining the content in the way like, is this correct, and it doesn't really, I think a lot of continental philosophers, like later ones like Zizek, will say it doesn't really fucking matter. It's like we have to look at the form, right? We have to look at the form. So for example, this is I think a pretty good one, like especially when you want to make like ideas around the structures and socioeconomic nature of the world, and like they talk a lot about like psychoanalysis, and a lot of analytical philosophers, and rightfully so in their field, would say like, look, that's fucking bullshit. Like like psychoanalysis has been proven wrong forever. And I think the big projects of late continental philosophy is to say like it doesn't matter, like that the content has been quote unquote incorrect. The form of it, when you look at the trajectory and the form of history, like psychoanalysis in form can give us a lot of answers. And same with like a lot of things, like even like dialectics. It doesn't matter if the content, quote unquote, when you look at it analytically, is quote unquote correct, but well, in form, dialectics still gives us a lot of ideas.
Yeah, I guess I understand the sort of pedagogical tools that you're putting up here, but I wouldn't say that that's all analytic myself. I mean,
Okay,
the
yeah,
idea of foundationalism versus, I mean, the medieval scholastics wouldn't have used maybe those words, but surely, foundationalism has gone from the scholastic era to Aristotle, where it had to have preceded the entire continental analytic divide. But yeah, I mean, I think the isms, I think you're absolutely right that the isms that we're sort of using, coherentism, foundationalism, when we sort of attach this to a sort of system, and we make that system explicit, these are the sort of linguistic tools that, or the
right.
sort of meta language that analytic philosophy has given us. And I think it's important. I think it's extremely important um, being able to, and I'll try to break down any concepts that we're talking about. By the way, if I'm
Sure.
ever, if you ever think that I'm going too far ahead.
Sure.
I think it's extremely important because it uses a sort of, or at least it attempts to universalize a certain type of language, right? Namely the isms that I talked about, into a lot of different types of systems. Um, it's important. We have to know that that eventually breaks down. Um, just with every single historical thinker that I can think of that I've studied, um, eventually the ways of categorizing those historical thinkers breaks down.
Hmm.
For example, is Kant a coherentist, foundationalist? Is he a libertarian about free will? Which, for your audience, there's theories of free will. Compatibilism, which just says, is determinism compatible with free will?
Hmm.
It's either incompatible or it's not compatible. Certain types of incompatible theses might be Kant's, who thought that free will is not reducible to any empirical observations. It's not a material thing. It's not any of that. But the way that he goes about proving that, and then the conclusions that he gets to, I wouldn't exactly match up squarely with libertarian free will as it's sort of understood in analytic literature. So it has some sort of limitations, but I think we all need to try to bridge that gap between the two thinkers, between the two schools. And at least for me, since I'm a structuralist, I don't know how sympathetic you are to structuralism as opposed to post-structuralism, but we need to
I
create
like both
systems.
in a
Okay.
weird way. That's a good. So you firmly place yourself in the structuralist camp.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm a monist. I think everything is sort of interconnected. Everything works functionally with purpose. I believe in purpose within the world. I believe in concepts
Right.
actually being in the world. So I'm a naturalized Platonist. I get into all sorts of spooky, or at least to some people, spooky metaphysics. Um, because I mean, like I don't want to sell myself short of anything other than the three big things existing in the world, and that's beauty, truth, and good, the good.
Right.
So
I so I think I definitely I think if I was having to choose, I would probably place myself in the structuralist camp as well. And that might partially be due to the fact that I haven't I've dived far more into structuralism than I have post-structuralism. But from some of the abstract arguments of post-structural thought, I see what they mean. When you get down into the very specifics, it's hard to pin down, like, even where, if structuralism, there is a foundational core or top hierarchical way of viewing structure. It's hard to even navigate and locate it. I get that, but I still think that in a lot of ways, structuralism and that thought still answers a lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I definitely have inversely read a lot less post-structuralist thinkers. I have read Baudrillard. I read Simulation or Simulacra. I can't ever remember which one's first, if it's the Simulacra or the Simulation, but I think
Yeah.
Simulacra and Simulation.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, yeah, I read that book. I thought it was interesting. I sort of one of the theorists that I read a little bit about called that a form of semiological idealism,
Yeah.
that the world has been replaced by signifiers and signs, and the real, they use a lot of fancy jargon.
A lot of Lacanian terminology. Yeah.
Yeah, the real, right, has become substituted by a fiction, or supposedly this is what's occurring, but so much that we can even no longer um, uh, create a distinction between the fiction and reality. So the fiction has replaced reality and has become the new reality, right? And this is kind of, I think, interesting, because we've gone from immediacy, we've gone from being in direct contact with the world for the ancients. This is sort of Hegelian,
Right.
direct access to the world. We see this in their art, in their metaphysics. They're naive realists in some sort of sense. We've gone from that to now we've gone on to, when we come to the sort of German era and the rationalists, representing the world, with representationalism. So we have certain types of schematas in our mind that sort of layer over how the world is. This is a crude analogy, but it's basically what's going on. To going from that sort of modernist movement to a postmodernist movement, to where the representation, the distinction between reality and appearance has sort of collapsed, and the fiction or the signs have replaced reality. And I think
Right.
that's true to some extent when we talk about the technological world that we live in, right? I mean,
Yeah.
um, uh, signs, the internet, social media, Disney World, all these things that Baudrillard,
So
kind of harps on.
someone in chat said this correctly. They said simulacra and simulation is the worst you can read from Baudrillard, and I like the ideas proposed in that, but that's probably true. I just read his The System of Objects. Holy fuck, is that a dense book? But yeah, he has a more Baudrillard is structural probably at that point, but I think I do like his more structural analysis of, like, semiotics, right? So for anyone here who doesn't know what semiotics, like, how the interaction of signs and symbols and stuff like that, how we navigate language and even, like, communication, stuff like that. But he takes a much more structural approach, from almost like everything still has a material structural referent to everything that he proposes in that book. And I think it's more reconcilable, in my opinion, than simulacra and simulation. But yeah, so and then on to, like, onto postmodernism. I look at, like, postmodernism more as like post-structuralism, what we were just talking about. I consider that post-structuralism, and I differentiate the two. I think people like Frederick Jameson kind of coined this, that really, like, if we're gonna call postmodernism anything, it's more like a cultural logic, and it's like a cultural mode of being, in some ways, like a mode of interaction of probably, like, and he says it, like, as late capitalism, right? So how and this is Baudrillard as well, but how we interact with lifestyle signs and symbols, and there's a confusion, there's just a sheer number of confusions. I know one of the most prescient things I can think of is, like, lost futures. Mark Fisher would coin something like lost futures, where the future is dead, and people are like, well, what the fuck does that mean? And essentially what he means is that, like, in especially 21st century capitalism, everything's kind of at this point, it's a reflection and a recycling of the 20th century. And that's partly to do with the socioeconomic order, where it's way more efficient to just recycle nostalgia, right? So, for example, like video games, like Resident Evil 2 did a remake and it was extremely successful. And a lot of video games nowadays are just recycled nostalgia to sell. We can say the same thing with music, fashion, stuff like that. So I try to always, whenever I bring, I've had a lot of people in my chat before. I always try to double down because a lot of people don't know what the fuck postmodernism means. But yeah, I consider like a lot of postmodernism is more like a cultural logic, while poststructuralism is sort of like it's like it's a moving past point of structuralism, right?
Hold on. Yeah. So, I don't. It's hard to say. I think they probably have. Sorry, I gotta pick this up real quick.
Yeah, no problem.
They probably have a lot of symmetries.
Sure, sure.
So it's always kind of hard defining things like postmodernism. I don't know if maybe your audience knows this, how hard that can be. Maybe it doesn't, but you read someone like is it pronounced Leotard? Leotard?
I think so. I think that's right.
Yeah. And this is actually also in the Wikipedia. He sort of defined it as the incredulity towards meta-narratives. What the Wikipedia doesn't tell you, I think, is that he renounced that sort of definition of postmodernism.
I think I would too. I don't know exactly what he said on that. I kind of I kind of interject there because I think that's actually really kind of important in some ways. A lot of people misconstrue like what people think by postmodern philosophy is like a rejection of grand narratives, a rejection of like objectivity and truth. And I really think when we look at it, like the best definition of postmodernism truly is just cultural logic. It's just like a mode of being in like late capitalism. And in many ways, I've even, thought about this more as well. In some ways, I even consider like postmodernism like very hyper modernity, at least in consequence. So I know that's very confusing. So, like a lot of the early Enlightenment ideals of individuality, of rationality, of compartmentalized being, like, for example, someone like Locke, like when you look at the concrete form of America, like neighborhoods just scream John Locke. Everyone has their fenced-in backyards. People have their individual houses, stuff like that. And then what happens through that process, maybe we can say a dialectic of modernity moving forward, is you hit a point where we're now in postmodernism. And in postmodernism seems a lot of the consequence of postmodernism, how we live, is like a hyper individual realm of stuff. And it is like a fetish of sign and symbol. And in a lot of ways, I've been able to connect that. I think a lot of reactionary thinkers, like I say reactionary people like Jordan Peterson, will say like they think postmodernism is some like collectivist like mode of being and shit. And it's the exact opposite. Postmodernism is incredibly individualistic, yeah, I've that's something that I've definitely been thinking about lately, and I've definitely came to that conclusion that I think I find the cultural logic of postmodernism incredibly, radically individualistic.
Yeah.
Poor Jordan Peterson.
No, he deserves, I think, more of a backlash.
I do too.
I mean, I know that in philosophy he's become everyone's favorite whipping boy, but it's just insane though. I still have friends that want to be like Jordan Peterson apologists and try to defend as much as they can. So it always ends up being like, okay, well, I agree with you, Marty, that he doesn't know anything about Marxism or anything about postmodernism, but and here comes the apologetics, right? But he knows a little bit about psychology, he knows a little bit about this, and I'm just like, well, I mean, not really. I mean, have you looked at his like lecture videos? They're very boring. I mean, some people like him going through Disney and talk about Jung But
Apparently he gets Jung wrong too. I wouldn't know, but apparently he's very wrong on Jung as well.
yeah, no, I mean, he's really wrong on Heidegger. He's really
Mm-hmm.
wrong on Jung. Apparently, he barely got into that university as a lecturer. One of his friends ended up helping him out.
Oh,
And let's just be honest. A lot of his advice, right, is just dad advice. You know,
yeah.
it's just like don't get on. You know, like don't criticize people for getting on the skateboard, clean your room. The 12 rules of life. I mean, I can't remember them all. He's creating another list. They're not very interesting things, right?
It's truly mind blowing. Also, his ideas of Nietzsche and how he uses Nietzsche is the most laughably dumb fuck thing. I like the idea that he even talks about Nietzsche is really wild to me because he's like the exact, especially with like language. Well, you can't like I see that with like he talks about like gender and the nuanced progression, the new progression of language being constructed and stuff. Like, you motherfucker, you're referencing Nietzsche. That is like Nietzsche's whole thing is like it doesn't fucking matter. Like it, you know. Like
yeah, go ahead.
No. Yeah, you know, you're good.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to keep a track of all the topics that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because now we've gone to Nietzsche. I've read actually quite a bit of Nietzsche. I'm not a fan because it's very unsystematic philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know what the fuck.
It's an
Jordan
artistic
Peterson,
philosophy for sure.
I don't even know what the fuck Jordan Peterson believes about Nietzsche. Or Nietzsche, however you guys pronounce it. Yeah, it's just I remember him having like this super psychological account of Heidegger at least, um, to where he thought like Dasein. I don't know if you read Being in Time. I've read it.
Yeah.
He thinks like it's like the same thing as like a, a sort of consciousness or a
Yeah.
subjectivity, and he has this like weird analysis of where like he treats the ecstasies of time, and I won't get into this, but he treats the ecstasies of time in a sort of very phenomenalist, subjective way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I can't even remember how just mind-bogglingly wrong his analysis of that was, and how, especially recently, he talked to like some sort of guy on a podcast about how reality is getting better, and our society is full of all these people that are doom and gloom types. This is like the sort of Steven Pinker
Yeah.
shtick that I cannot fucking stand. He just he basically accuses people, a lot of people our generation, uh, I'm definitely on that bus, of being doom and gloom and pessimists, and not being optimists about the world. But life is getting better. Life is getting better. Don't overemphasize the horrible shit that's going on. Overemphasize the positive shit, and it's just like, but you're overemphasizing it, and like, so what? Like, yeah, a lot of the statistics you're pulling are true. It's not like we're going to dispute them, but it doesn't matter. It's just like this isn't going to solve any of the problems. This is just going to give us like a form of stoicism
Right.
that that it isn't really needed in order to progress society, right? It's not going to serve as a catalyst, I
Right.
guess is what I'm going to say.
This is exactly where I think Jordan Peterson in some ways is an ironic postmodern thinker, where I think in some ways postmodernism can be kind of visualized a little bit by cultural nihilism, but it's like a nihilism that appears as its opposite. Like it's a it's almost like a libidinal, like maybe something psychoanalysis can kind of help us do this, but like it's like a coping mechanism where like, look, like it's, and this is how Jordan Peterson operates, right? This is exactly, it's like life is suffering, and it is suffering, and we have to find meaning in that. And it, like, there's nothing in my mind more postmodern than that, because there is no like referent to a lot of things, right? He talks about statistics, but they're kind of, like you said, they're sort of cherry picked. And so what you get to is like this really weird, almost like in some ways a hyper reality of what happens, of everything, right? With this, like, you know, like, oh, you're just being too pessimistic and stuff. And it just seems like pure postmodern nihilistic cope. It's a nihilism that isn't necessarily that, like, I think there's the most nihilistic thing that you can do isn't to just like kind of it's just a state of being depressed. It's like just massive cope, I think, and a systematic cope and a political cope, and yeah, again in many ways nihilism's a logic like postmodernism, and I find that really ironic with Jordan Peterson, is that like That in my mind is so fucking postmodern. But yeah, I just want to point that out.
Um, I also liked what you just said there briefly about it's sort of also being a hyper real projection
Yeah,
of what's going on. That's probably true actually.
yeah.
Especially if you're an insane optimist about a lot of different types of things and only begin talking about shit that I hold on just a second. I think oh yeah, I did fuck that up. Insane optimist about a lot of things is that you sort of create a sort of idealized projection of society and then sort of sweep up everything that's bad underneath the rug. That can get into a lot of problems, but yeah, Jordan Peterson has too many problems, too many problems, and they haven't been addressed on live television. And I got really pissed off that Zizek didn't fire him up a little bit more, like burn his ass on some of the shit that he was saying in that debate, because you could tell like Jordan Peterson when he had that debate, the only goddamn thing that he ever read about Marxism was like the Communist Manifesto, which is a propaganda pamphlet.
Yeah.
So it's not supposed to give you an exposition of anything,
No,
right?
no, not at all. No, oh my God, that's why. Like a lot of people, I read the Communist Manifesto. It gives the idea of the prescriptive politics of Marxism, but holy fuck, there's so much analysis and descriptive analysis of Marxism that yeah. The Communist Manifesto is like not the last, but it's like I would actually read the manifesto like after reading like a lot of the descriptive, the understanding of the formations of dialectical materialism, historical materialism. It's like the manifesto is the conclusion that you come to in some ways, the political conclusions. But yeah, it's that is exactly what it is. It's a propaganda manifesto sort of like thing. And yeah, no, I think I share that. I wish Zizek would have fired more on him. He did a couple times. He talked about how like there is no Marxist in academia. There fucking isn't. That is a complete lie. Like Marxists don't exist in academia, like in almost any capacity anymore. I mean, a little bit. There's like Richard Wolff. There's a couple people, but like no real mainstream academics today are really like Marxist. And but I think Zizek took a pretty political tone to that stream, like tactically like wise. I think he wanted to really convey to his audience that like, look, I understand what you mean by this hyper individual liberal form of like identity fetish of this. I don't mean to like Zizek has a very good critique of transgenderism. I don't like using that because I don't think transgender people should ever be partitioned to an ism, but maybe if there is some like maybe some of the mode of like of new identity radically changing identity versus the past, it might be because of like a cultural fetish of individuality. I think Zizek talks about how like, yeah, identity politics isn't necessarily the best way to approach politics, and I think he wanted to point out that like, look, the left, like actual Marxist or people like that, actually kind of reject a lot of analysis on those grounds. So I think he went into that debate looking to really try to convey to his audience, and I actually kind of think he probably did it. He did a good job in that regard. But I'm with you there, where if I probably was debating Jordan Peterson, I probably would lay into him way more than he did.
That there was one moment of where he kind of asked why Jordan Peterson conflates, and I can't remember the answer that he gave. I remember being just completely unsatisfied with it. He asked him the question, well, why do you conflate postmodernism with Marxism? They don't seem to be. Like one's completely anti-foundationalistic, sort of the semiological idealism, signs and structures. The other one is just like, okay, well, there's a foundationalism. There's a foundation. It's structural. It's called the material world. That's going to basically like lay the grounds for why there's oppression, and that's going to lay the grounds for the distinction between the proletariat and the bourgeois, right? And you need to kind of talk about that.
Yeah.
You need to talk about that. And it's just like, and then he went on to talking about how there's no human nature in Marx. I'm like, well, why didn't Zizek just say like, yeah, there is. Like,
yeah, like Marx talks about species essence quite a bit in response to alien. His entire foundation of alienation relies on sort of like an essential nature of humanity in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that I get, and again, I'm no expert on this, is that there's a very huge plasticity within the sort of human nature
Sure.
of that Marx sort of has. I'm kind of of course, I believe in human nature, but I think it's sort of impossible not to.
Right.
But that's not in opposition to forms of constructivism about
Yeah.
human nature, right? All you have to all you have to do to minimally believe in a human nature means that there's some sort of that there's probably some sort of set of biological principles that are hardwired or sort of created in order for people to act in certain ways that evolution selected for. Um, or at least act in a certain type of way that is adaptable towards the certain type of environment that you have. I don't mean like the things that we do 2,000 years ago or 8,000 years ago, or the things that we have to do now, which would be really dumb. And a lot of people have that sort of dumb image of evolutionary theory. So I mean, like you could basically just show like, look, there's no biological essence or like genomic structure, if that's a word, that predetermines, right? That's just like a form of biological determinism, how we're going to act and what our sexuality is like,
Mm-hmm.
or any of that. And if you charitably take that to be what people are saying these days, like that's the type of conclusion that you ought to get into, right? It's
Yeah.
just that people are basically saying that they're not determined by their genes, and they're not. I mean, like a lot of good biologists basically don't think that we're predetermined by our genes. Um, I think it was one of the types of heroes that I have when I've been reading. Ian McGilchrist made the point that, like, look, if genes were predetermined what we are going to do, right, we'd have no changes, no gradual changes within within the anatomy of human beings and other creatures through an evolutionary continuum. Um, but we can see those quite gradual changes, or even sometimes swift changes. For example, we've done some gene editing. I can't remember if it was with a fly or a mosquito, but some sort of insect. We'll edit it enough to take out its eyes, so it couldn't see. 4 generations or 5 generations later, the eyes came back. Is that because the genes were, predetermining the fly? I don't know if it was a fruit fly or whatever type of fly. No, it's because obviously the environment is going to impact the sort of relationship of the internal form of the organism.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, like, so you could be sort of a constructivist about who we are,
Right.
because who we are is going to determine how our body is going to act. Look at our diets. I mean, that's going to it's a really bad thing. That's going to ultimately affect our future generations, and basically how our anatomy is going to be shaped, and how detrimental our biology is going to be in the future as well. So, I mean, people need to know exactly what biological constructivism exactly entails.
Right. And I think like you said with the new scientific like study, or like that little experiment with gene editing. This is kind of also too, you got to make the claim that but a lot of people always are like, "Man, what the fuck is philosophy for nowadays?" It's a really good example of where philosophy is very applicable today. But I was going to ask you, so why did the eyes come back? That's really interesting. Do they have a
Um,
conclusion?
I mean, they're just selected for, basically, like eyes, as far as we know in evolutionary theory. You can find isolated cases all throughout the world. They have come into existence basically in separate areas, not connected in any sort of capacity, and they're just sort of forced onto it because the world sort of demands the organism to have those, so it can interact with the environment and basically be able to do that. I don't know if this part's true, but I recall there being something about like light conditions making the sea a lot more darker, and as soon as like I can't remember exactly how it was when the ocean. Someone can probably correct me in the chat. Like when the oceans I guess became more translucent, transparent. Uh, you had more visible light basically underneath the ocean. Eyes were sort of selected for as a form of evolutionary adaptation, or natural selection rather. And the sort of these selective pressures basically are the reasons for why eyes came about.
Is that like, so if the eyes came back, is that something like hardwired within the like DNA? I'm not a scientist. I'm just wondering how the fuck, if you edit the genes, how does through generation it comes back? Is that like
Well, that's what the biological determinism is supposed to. Sorry, that's how we combat biological determinism. It wasn't instilled within the genes. It was basically an environmental pressure which changed the the structure of the
Oh,
genes.
oh, okay. So were they released into an environment? I was thinking that they were like in a test tube or some shit, or like in a lab.
No, no,
They were released
no.
back into the environment blind. Oh,
Yeah,
okay. All right, that makes perfect sense then. Okay, sure.
yeah. And if they were in a, at least I think so. But if they were in a sort of tested environment, eventually they just kind of changed anyways. I
Oh,
don't
wow.
actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would assume that either way it doesn't make much of a difference if you have similar selective pressures. Um, what was I going to say? So I mean, like, and this is actually sort of in relation to a lot of the tendencies that I have in the philosophy of biology. I tend to be very non-reductionistic when it comes to biology. Coming back kind of full circle to where we began. When I told you about the relational properties instead of the monadic properties. So monadic are just one thing, right?
Mhm.
Leibniz's theories of monads, sort of atomic structures. There's a little bit of a difference between atoms and monads.
Is this like Spinozian, like
No,
monad?
no,
Yeah.
no, no.
Oh,
Leibnizian,
okay,
Leibniz.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Leibnizian monads, but I'm using it in a different way from Leibniz. I'm just saying like one singular entity that's discrete, kind of like how you were talking about the Lockean substances or
Mhm.
Lockean objects.
Mhm.
Um, so I mean, I tend to think that biology, and it might need to be viewed even more than this, but biology also has to be viewed very dynamically.
Right.
Um, this shouldn't be a shock to hear, but a lot of people, regardless of agreeing with me that it's dynamic, say things like this, right? That everything is reducible towards its parts, and a rearrangement of parts chair-wise, sorry, a rearrangement of certain types of fundamental particles or chemicals is just a mereological sort of reshaping. There is nothing new or novel that comes about. It's just particles arranged chairwise or particles arranged, I don't know, body wise or human wise. Um, but I think that we can't actually reduce what a human being is biologically, agentically, mentally, to its parts, because the function of what a body does is going to be often determined. So the yeah, what a body is, its whatness is going to be determined with what it does, its functional aspect. So its material grounds are going to be situated through its functional relationship with the world. So, for example, to kind of nail this point home, is imagine a foreign microbe entering into a human body, right? When it enters into a human body, is it is it now part of the identity of a human body, or is it a foreign microbe? Is it something
Right.
that we call it me, or do we call it a microbe?
This is
Well,
kind of a is this sort of this is kind of like a lot of what Hegel talks about, right? In some ways, and even like Heidegger, yeah.
I don't know about Heidegger. Hegel does talk about this a little bit within the science of logic, I think,
Mhm.
and mostly within his philosophy of nature when he talks about life. Um, but let me finish the
Sure,
point
sure,
real
sure.
quick. Um, so what are we talking about when we're talking about identity, right? So, I mean, like
Mhm.
this problem goes back to like the ship of Theseus. When does the ship of Theseus stop becoming the ship of Theseus? When we, take out the pieces of wood. When does it stop being that, and when is it still that? So we could do this for human bodies as well, and there's a sort of interesting answer to it, I think. Um, when does the microbe become the human body, and when does it stop becoming the human body?
Right.
Um, so what we need to appeal to is not more material parts when we're trying to find out what the human body is, but if you will, what Michael Thompson uses is the sort of outer context is only going to determine what the human body is. So the microbe that's entering into the human body can either assimilate to the body or be rejected by the body, and that's going to be determined by the immunity system.
Okay.
If the immunity system rejects it, then it can become a pathogen and it can become detrimental towards our health. And I think that this is a really good standard for identity relations. If it's accepted, and a lot of bacteria a lot of microbes come into our body and it can help it, then it's going to be assimilated to our body, and then basically there is an identity statement between that and our body. And I think that's sort of interesting, is that what's going to determine that is the sort of immunity system, meaning the sort of internal organization of our body and its sort of context with this new entity. So we're cashing that out functionally. Is this kind of making sense, or is this okay?
No. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Another example is, like, let's say that we were to, a very basic example, cut off some of our cells and then put them into a little glass container, whatever, so scientists can see them. No amount of probing the material in that vial is going to tell us what those cells can amount to functionally, if they're related to other things, right? You can get a microscope, you can examine those cells as much as you want, but until you put them in a certain type of environment, you won't know what they do. And if they are attached to a body, which is a kind of environment, they're going to completely act differently than compared to how they are isolated in an isolated sense. So you can't create a sort of reductive model through just material conditions alone. You always have to find it in a sort of external environment and sort of dynamic relationships. You get a very polyadic metaphysics, or an ontology, if you will. One that has to be, I think, cashed out functionally instead of materially, through forms instead of matter, to use some Aristotelian jargon.
Okay. I wonder if there's like, in my mind, I get like my mind kind of wanders, being sort of the critical theory fan that I am, to like sociological conclusions from that. I wonder, like, with identity as well, is there like, or even, like making value judgments on like morality and stuff. Is it like sociologically determined then? Like if something's pathological to our being, if there's a measurable pathology to, I don't know, like,
yeah.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding your question right, so you're basically asking, like, okay, well, we in medicine, right? Or when doctors sort of deal with us, we have certain types of normative conditions. We have a set of normal principles or norms that we want to be in accordance with. That is to say, we want certain types of internally bodily temperatures, right? We want a sort of production of matter being converted into energy for ourselves, into ATP. And we want a certain type of homeostasis and balance of how the body works. Otherwise, it's going to not function correctly and we're going to die. And we typically say that this is unhealthy and this is not what we ought to do. And this is against the human biology. But you're asking this in terms of its sociological context, or psychological context.
Yeah, I'm wondering if, like, we can even conceptually contend with the form of how that works, right? So what ideas are pathological to a society if there's an input and output system or mechanism, kind of like how biologically, like a pathogen would come in if it's rejected or not. I just want, that's interesting. I never thought about it in those lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have some answers there, but I think it starts getting into certain types of territories of where we cross the is-ought gap distinction.
Right.
And a lot of people are going to hit back on this. I don't think I really have, I don't see how they can hit back on it completely, unless you just, or what's called like a nominalist about identity, to where you say, like, there is no fact of the matter what Marty or Epoch is, Epoch philosophy as a person. There is no continuity between time t1 and time t3. We should just discard the idea of identity except as a useful tool of dissecting the world through our minds. And the same thing can be then said about sociology, psychology, medicine. Let's not view it in terms of what we ought to do. but only through certain types of ends. That is, if we want to achieve a certain type of end, then I had to have my body this way. If I want to achieve certain types of happiness, then I want a society structured in this way.
That makes
I
sense.
don't, yeah, I don't tend to agree with that model though,
Okay.
um, because I think this gets because there are obviously societies that are not conducive towards our health in any sort of way. There are obviously things that are going to destroy what type of being we are. For example, if I was just to throw a person in a vat of acid, well, what's that? I mean, like, how is that going to, in any sort of way, sustain my biology, any of my psychology, any of the sociological benefits that we want? It's not right. It's not going to be useful in any sort of way. It's not going to be operating in accordance with any sort of norms that I think are prescribed by biology. Um, so, I mean, I would say the same thing maybe about sociology and psychology or politics is that we need to create a environment which is going to be conducive towards people being able to use Kantian jargon, harmonize their ends with the ends of others, treat people as a end in themselves instead of a means to an end, and sort of create a sort of universal ethical system of which we all operate in order to have this sort of harmony possible. If society can't do that, then I think it's out of accordance with human nature. And those are the sort of most broadest forms of human nature that I would be able to categorically prescribe myself to. I don't know too many people that would say like, "Hey, man, treat that person as an object instead of an end in themselves." Like, when would that ever historically like be okay? Right? We have a name for that generally, and it's been slavery, right?
Right.
So, I mean, it's like certain types of ethical norms, we just seem to reject altogether, and that's why I'm sort of a moral realist. So,
Right. So there is some constructive like kind of essence or nature that there's some universal we could still probably point to
at least with the types of human beings that we are right
right
now.
now. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we could change drastically. That is like genetic editing, or like I don't know, like our bodies can become part robots or whatever, to where you reach this sort of weird technological age. But given that we know a lot of standard conditions of what make our bodies healthy and makes our minds reach, a state of happiness. Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, I think you can, and given that we know what our rationality is like, yeah, we can prescribe certain types of norms, right? And we can codify these norms into what we call laws. So yeah, yeah,
Okay, yeah, wow, I never thought about that. Feels very Kantian from my little understanding of Kant.
yeah. It's
Y-
very.
yeah,
I'm a
yeah,
con. Uh,
yeah, no, I really like Kant. I haven't read gone too deep into Kant. I had some classes that I definitely had to go into Kant for, but yeah, I like that. That's an interesting structure and way to analyze stuff. I've never totally really contended with that, but that's probably a very good that that seemed yeah no I like that. I haven't totally thought about it in that way, but I do I think that's a good abstract baseline approach I that's much more structured than I typically approach stuff. Yeah.
and then once you begin reading all these thinkers, try to reconcile them with Marx. I mean, you'll find it might be I mean, impossible, or
Yeah.
two, really difficult. That's the boat that I am at. I mean, I like Marx, I like Hegel, I like Kant. I don't know how to reconcile some of that.
Marx and Engels talk about Kant. Let me see if I have it. Kant and Liberalism at part 2 of the German Ideology. I need to read that, but talking about that, it's actually right here in the German Ideology. I'm sure there is. I don't know actually. I don't know how you would reconcile with that from a Marxian perspective, but they got it right here in the German Ideology part 2.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I say they might be irreconcilable is because I don't know if Kant believes in things like the categorical imperative, and I know that Hegel really wants to
I
historicize
thought the categorical
reason.
imperative was a very Kantian thing.
It is, yeah. That's
Oh,
why I'm
okay.
saying I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile it with Marx.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that That I'm trying to think. I never thought about trying to reconcile that with Marx, but um, there isn't a lot of more, because the categorical imperative is kind of a moralistic sort of thing, right? Like it's a form of understanding morality, right?
Yeah.
Well, Marx and Engels don't really talk. This is maybe potentially there's tons of problems with Marxism. Um, and I'll get fucking torn apart for saying that, but whatever, there is. And I think that's kind of one of them. There isn't like a moralistic tonality to anything. There isn't. They talk about like bad human conditions, especially Engels, but they don't really delve into a deeper moral theory and how they approach shit. Rather, they're very analytical. They're very sort of like scientific, quote unquote. I don't like it. Our idea of science today is so different than theirs. They consider themselves scientists, but maybe analytical thinkers. But yeah, I think because most people take moralistic approaches with Marxism, yet Marx and Engels were not very moral thinkers. Like not that they're like immoral, but like they didn't take a moral tonality to their approach,
Yeah.
which is a big misunderstanding a lot of people have.
Apparently, it's probably not a good time to be streaming right now because
Uh-oh.
there is a Mars landing right now
Oh
with the
shit. I do probably have to I probably should get going. I think we've been doing this for about 2 hours, but dude, it's been a lot of fun. If you're comfortable with that, we can probably end here, maybe.
Yeah, we could definitely talk sometime in the future, but I think we've, wrapped up a lot of concepts that I've been sort of interested in and, you know, uh, kind of analyzed a lot of different things. So yeah. Is it okay if I talk about my stream just a brief
Oh,
bit?
please do.
Yeah, so I mean, for those of you who are coming in late or anything like that, my stream is called The Philosophy Chat. You can find me on YouTube slash the Philosophy Chat, also on Twitch slash the Philosophy Chat. I also have a Discord channel that has about 10,000 people in it right now, and that's called just Discord slash Philosophy. We managed to get that name, which is pretty nice. So yeah, I mean, I do a lot of commentary on metaphysics and epistemology, and I kind of occasionally do debates with people, like Destiny, sometimes Vosh. That's generally not something that I enjoy as much as just talking about metaphysics. And then
Right.
I also have discussions with people like perspective philosophy, and
If you
right
don't
now
mind me
epoch
asking,
philosophy.
I was gonna ask before you go, how the fuck did you get on Vosh and Destiny? That's interesting. How did that happen?
Um, so I mean, I didn't get on Vosh's. I've been trying to ask him for
Oh,
like
okay.
ages right now, but I've talked to Vosh. But anyways, how I got to Destiny, it's not that exciting of a story. He occasionally on his Discord channel just takes random viewers and asks, and they could talk about whatever they want. And about 2018 or 2019, one of the things that Destiny was getting into was the philosophy of mind and a little bit of philosophy. He was starting to graze against that. Um, and so he was a materialist, and I came on there basically and said like, okay, well, here's an argument against for why the mind can't just possibly be the brain, and I gave him a sort of argument for it, and he's just like, eventually, about 30 or 40 minutes down, he's just like, okay, well, I don't know how to reply to that actually, so I'm just
Mhm.
gonna have to think about it. And so I just kind of came coming back, and then like talking about like why materialism isn't true, um, why the mind isn't reducible, why ethics have to be real. And this kind of gathered, his interest. He was trying to, see different types of perspectives from people who, have some sort of sense in being able to talk about these types of topics. And right now, it's been a few years later. I'm still talking to him occasionally. He gave me this tag on his Discord called Notable, which allows me to basically join his stream at any point and any time as long as he's on there to talk to him. So we're going to be doing Rem actually set this up with him. We're going to be doing a philosophy, not podcast, but a philosophy panel of 5 philosophers talking to each other about all sorts of bullshit in epistemology and metaphysics coming up. I guess I don't know how this is going to be set up. I guess we're just going to be debating a bunch of general shit about philosophy. And yeah, I mean, let's hope we wreak some havoc and get some viewers on board and educate them about, you know, the harsh realities of epistemology and metaphysics. So
Dude, that's sick. That's something that I've always you know, I don't watch a lot of Destiny or Vosh. I talk a lot about that. Well, I have to talk a lot about them because they hold so much sway and a lot of like general public discourse about stuff. But I find what they often talk about, not to their fault, but the environment around them is so fucking we talked about this earlier, it's so radically insufficient at getting at anything. And I think having, you know, someone like you talk about like the very specific philosophical backings of stuff is so fucking important, dude. That's why, like, if I ever got like you know, a lot of people like, I don't enjoy their stuff, so like a lot of people would probably imagine I wouldn't go like on there, and people probably wouldn't, it probably wouldn't be that enjoyable. But goddamn, I think one thing that I want to convey is like, look, guys, this is like, this cultural politics that you see on Twitch and shit is so radically insufficient that, like, truly, I think someone like you could definitely do a lot of good, man. If you can get on Vosh especially, not that like I'm shitting on Vosh or anything like that. I actually, matter of fact, don't know enough to really like shit on them at all. But I know that it's a very cultural, I want to say like a cultural political thing. It's not very concrete, and that's, again, not totally their fault. But I think if you can bring that shit down to planet Earth and in a constructive and an intellectual manner, that's so positive. Because like we were talking about, some of the future emancipation it probably does come from like an individual educational level, or at least our approach, right? And our approach is not intellectual. It's very it's very ideological and sort of group jouissance sort of thing.
Forgot what the word jouissance means.
Like the psycho, like pleasure, like it's so there's before we go, I'll make this really quick. Like, some of the most interesting ideas from people like Zizek and Lacan is like the jouissance of losing politics. So like, this sounds really surface level, like, yeah, of course that makes sense, but like, really, like, when you look at it, a lot of politics and people's meaning is like being on the losing end of politics. And like, in some ways, if psychoanalysis is to understand the subconscious underpinnings of our nature and what we do, how we act, it's in some ways we can see like, we don't do the things that we should do to win because there's like a jouissance of being oppressed or being on the losing end of politics. It gives you like meaning, and psychoanalysis shows us that there's an inherent lack in our being. But yeah.
Yeah, no. I guess one last thing as well. I'm sorry. If you have to cut it off, just tell me.
No,
right
it's
now.
okay.
But, yeah, I have definitely more luck with Destiny. God, you know, I don't want to call out Bosch, but I have a lot more luck on Destiny. At least being able to talk about just generally anything, as long as it's like within a certain type of discourse that he can understand and the audience can understand. Although I definitely lose the audience and bore the audience sometimes. So it's kind of funny how their reactions are.
I find a little bit of sympathy with Destiny's irritation with like quote unquote internet tankies. I find I've seen him bitch and moan about that correctly, and how everything is just so like it's just the political discourse. I say that as someone who's pretty fucking Marxist. I sympathize with that heavily. I don't know. I don't know his conclusions. I think at some point I thought he was like a kind of like a neoliberal person, or maybe like but I think he's like a soc dem. Is he? I don't really know myself. So.
It's really hard to figure out what he is. I think he really likes people like Milton Friedman. I don't know how far he is in terms of like a neoclassic.
I don't like Milton
liberal.
Friedman.
Yeah, no, neither do I. Which is really weird because then he talks to someone like a Marxist socialist, like Perspective Philosophy.
Okay.
And he seems to sympathize with a lot of it. I do know he's a capitalist. I do know he's a liberal, but those, you know, I mean, that the semantic range of these concepts is so wide that it doesn't really mean anything other than you're in opposition to even more crazy people like fucking modern day conservatives, which are really just nationalists. I mean,
Right.
they're just fucking nationalists. It's just horrific.
Yep, and not only that, like leftists a lot of the times don't even know what the fuck liberalism means. Like there's no referent to like there's no universal referent to what like liberalism is thrown around like fucking candy. Like it's there is no real concrete what I've noticed as well. And it's not to say I have again, I'm a critical theory fan. There's so many fucking critiques about liberalism, but nonetheless, there's this cultural sort of fetish around politics and meaning and ideological group jouissance, like we just said earlier, that it's just it's fucking hard to navigate anything. Where I do sympathize with, even though if I probably don't agree with Destiny, I do sympathize with a lot of his issues with that lazy approach to politics.
Yeah, it's he's at least pretty good at being able to pick apart certain types of arguments pretty fast. If I wasn't familiar at all with philosophy, I don't think I could do what he does.
Mm-hmm.
With Vosh, and he might be actually closer to your own beliefs, but it's just like with Vosh, it's like at least the other people that I've seen talking with him, I've talked with him only once on air, but I've talked with him on PM a few times. But on air, it seems like it's just kind of a stone wall sometimes. He's a Marxist slash utilitarian slash ethical egoist. All those things mixed together, and then he basically, he'll fight for basically public ownership of businesses. He'll fight for a lot of, I don't know, socialist sounding tendencies. But then also just say like, yeah, I only debate to really win because it's fun, or I debate because it's like because like I value it subjectively, or like who cares really about truth in and of itself? That doesn't matter. It's only as a means for me to fulfill certain types of objectives, because in the end, all that we can really prove are subjective values.
Right.
He should just remain agnostic on those issues, because even if you might be able to, through some stretch of the imagination, prove those positions, which I don't think you can.
Right.
Like they just sound bizarre, and they sound really fucking stupid on the air. Like, right, they're just like, yeah, everything that I do is just for my own hedonistic, selfish pleasures. I mean, it's just like, no, just say you're a fictionalist about ethics. Like, there's no fact of the matter whether they exist, but like we have to treat them as if they do at the minimum, right? Like, just don't commit yourself to harsh meta-ethical claims about the ultimate structural reality of ethics. I mean, I'll do that, and
Right.
I've offered him advice on it, but it's very fucking hard to prove any of that. Ethics is like one of the hardest fucking things to prove, whether it really exists or whether it doesn't exist.
That's where I get to the point, and we'll wrap this up. Yeah, when it comes to like a lot of philosophy at large, being intellectually honest in a lot of ways, it's kind of hard in some realms not to be completely agnostic. Like in some ways, that's something that I noticed that a lot of people who aren't agnostic about a lot of philosophy, they actually just kind of, there's like an ideological tonality to everything. There's an emotional attachment to it, and that's understandable. I'd imagine that would probably be something like that Vosh would have, especially with like socialism. I think that's kind of like his branding. I think I don't know too much. A lot of people tell me I don't know shit about Vosh, and I probably don't. But yeah, I know some people have said Vosh tells people not to read theory, and I think that's so fucking stupid. As someone if someone who considers himself a socialist, that's very wrong. But I don't know. I have no fucking idea. But
it's okay. I mean, I don't know too much about his political belief, and to be honest with you, sometimes I wonder if they know really
right.
anything about their own political belief. Um, they certainly don't know too much about ethics. That's fine. Meta
Yeah.
ethics is not too huge of a concern. At least at some levels where you're just trying to reach an audience, a wide audience, about political issues. But I wish they wouldn't say things like "let's not investigate theory." That if they did say that, that's just insane, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
just basically saying, "Hey, don't read books." Like, what did it ever do? Like, what
I
good did books ever do for anybody ever? It's just like
That's a common
what?
thing that you'll see. Again, someone who's acquainted with sort of the internet left, as I'll call them, I guess. That's kind of not totally common. It's like a split community in that regard. Like some people say, no, it doesn't matter. You don't got to be like, no, but it does matter. Like having a good fundamental abstract base of like understanding, the in politics you are trying to employ is so fucking important, I think. But yeah. But
Yeah,
anyways, yeah. Sorry.
one last thing, sorry.
Sorry.
You should, if you do want to talk to these people, it's not too fucking hard. Just fucking PM them. Go on Destiny's server, and when he's doing a blah, 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 letting people, just random people, chat with him. Just go on there, get in line, and then be like, "Hey, I heard all of these, and these things. Like, I disagree with all these things. Just know that if you're doing that, you're going to enter into a certain type of debate, right? And you're gonna have to pay a sort of price for getting into that debate. So it's like with Destiny or with Vosh, right? There's an entry sort of fee. You have to impress people. You have to be able to, do whatever. And it might be easy for you. I mean, I didn't really find it very difficult to talk about a lot of ethical issues, a lot of philosophical issues with people who don't have too much background knowledge in it. But yeah, I just wanted to warn you, if you should do that if you can, and secondly, if you do that, I think it would be interesting and would definitely provide more viewers for your content, especially since you're a political commentator. I'm not, so it's definitely fucking hurt me, and so I've been wanting to read more literature, more theory. But for you, even if you did like one or two, you'd probably get like 100 extra viewers just tacked on by doing it. So
interesting. Yeah, I think my biggest thing that I'd want to do is just appeal to their audience a little bit. Like someone like Destiny, I think because he has an audience that is super sympathetic to really overly harsh ideological politics, which I have a huge sympathy to that as well. That's something that I would be like, look, a lot of these answers are in like theory and continental philosophy. Rather, I don't know if I'd debate him or contend with his ideas, which is probably what he'd like. But yeah, no, I would love to sometime. At least just have a discussion about that, and at least kind of, because no one talks about like theory a lot in a serious context, and it can really add clarity to a lot of people's approach to politics. But
yeah. I mean, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's wrap it up. But I'll let you have the last word. But I appreciate you having me on Epoch Philosophy. I enjoy this conversation. I generally, I like a little bit more laid back conversations where I don't have to be constantly, debating every single syllogistic argument. So I appreciate your time, and yeah, for you doing this. We need to do it sometime in the future when there's
absolutely
not a Mars landing thing going on, taking our audience.
Let's do it again soon. This is actually probably one of my favorite discussions I've had. I've had quite a few discussions. This is probably one of my more favorite ones. But yeah, so guys, anyone, your audience, yeah, just Epoch Philosophy. I assume some are kind of equated with it, but yeah, it's more continental philosophy, theory, stuff like that. But yeah, I appreciate you coming on so much, man. I'm gonna go ahead and head on out of here.
All right.
Thanks, care. Dude. You too. Bye. All right, guys. It's our little Discord camera thing I set up on there. I appreciate all you guys being here. That was I actually really enjoyed that. I don't know about you guys. I watched the Philosophy Chat a little bit on Destiny stream. My brother watches a lot of Destiny. He watches a lot of Destiny, and when I was messaging